Chapter 8. Mimics of Man. The animal world is filled with incongruous redundancies. There are insects that resemble twigs and sticks, fish that look like harmless underwater plants, animals that appear to be rocks and ferns. Some non-poisonous snakes imitate the coloring and appearance of their deadlier cousins. Numerous tasty insects discourage their enemies by imitating poisonous centipedes and scorpions. The animal and insect world is thronging with fakers and imitators and cunning masters of camouflage. One insect is so cleverly disguised that it can march along with formations of fierce army ants unnoticed. It even imitates the scent of the many ants. Man, the most vicious and wanton killer of the animal world and the natural enemy of all wild things, has his imitators, too. Overt contacts between man and paranormal have numbered in the millions throughout history. Legend and lore are rich with such incidents of contact. Our great religions are founded upon encounters with angels and demons. The annals of psychic phenomena are filled with accounts of seemingly chance meetings with these ultra-terrestrials. Some of them seem dull and inconsequential and even easily explainable, others are witnessed by groups of reliable people and produce testimony that would have been written by a drunken science fiction author. Living among us undetected may be creatures, not necessarily alien, with all the outward appearances of human beings, urologist Alex Saunders wrote in Quest magazine. October 1969. The mimic would of necessity be a lone wolf, likely living in a large, bustling city where the eccentric and the odd may flourish unhindered. For it is a curious part of nature that which is in plain view is often best hidden. Another famous ufologist, Int Michel, has also commented on these mysterious mimics. Certain cases have been checked and found to be perfectly authentic. But they are so absurd, because they are mimetic, that folk do not dare to talk about them. Useful research can ever be done so long as absurdity produces complexes in us. Early man was very aware of the existence of these mimics and tended to separate them into two groups, gods and demons. All religions have always warned their followers to be cautious of false angels and demigods. The Bible repeatedly discusses these entities and their influence upon man, always describing them as human-like beings usually traveling in threes and possessing remarkable superhuman powers. Be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares, we are warned in Hebrews 13:2. 3 men, usually of oriental countenance and dressed in somber black clothing, play important roles in both flying saucer and religious lore. For years the flying saucer researchers who encountered these men in black, MEB, believed they were secret agents of the CIA sent to harass them. These MEB have been seen most often riding about in large black automobiles, usually Cadillacs, and they have engaged in frightening tactics, harassing amateur UFO sleuths. There are hundreds of reports from all over the world in which these mysterious gentlemen have approached UFO witnesses and investigators, warning, even threatening, them to be silent about what they had seen. Since these entities and their big black automobiles have an uncanny talent for disappearing into thin air, investigators examining the stories of their victims have tended to dismiss such accounts as lies and hallucinations. Then, as has happened in so many cases, when these skeptical investigators had MEB encounters of their own, they have panicked in confusion. There has been an appalling number of sudden deaths, suicides, and nervous breakdowns among UFO investigators in the past 20 years. On the religious level, these same MEB, answering the same descriptions of the UFO harassers, have always been regarded as one agents of the devil, or the devil himself. The antics of these characters have kept the devil myth into modern times, and there are still numerous religious cults hopelessly engaged in battling and trying to outwit them, but they always manage to stay one jump ahead of their pursuers. Most of their deeds and manipulations appear to be nothing more than mischievous games. The activities of these para-humans are largely confined to specific areas of this planet, where they appear and reappear century after century. The angels keep their ancient places, poet Francis Thompson wrote. Thus there are many haunted places all over the world, shunned by ancient man or made sacred by him. These are precise geographical locations, and anyone digging into the history and lore of such locations will find thousands of accounts of ghosts. Demons, monsters, and flying saucers pinpointed within a few square miles and covering 1,000 years or more of time. To UFO cultists, such places are windows, entry points for spaceships from some distant planet. Occultists teach that these are gateways, weak spots in the Earth's etheric envelope through which beings from other space-time continuums seep through into our reality. Sussex County in England is one gateway, as are the Mississippi Valley, the Ohio Valley, and parts of our western states, such as the area around Frescott, Arizona. There are literally thousands of these weak spots all over our planet. Paranormal and supernatural activities in these areas seem to be controlled by complicated cyclic factors. Periodically, all hell breaks loose in all these places simultaneously, and then we have a flap, or wave, of UFO sightings, apparitions, poltergeists, sudden inexplicable disappearances of animals and human beings, mysterious fires, and even a form of mass madness. Researchers are only now beginning to untangle the cycles involved. For some unknown reason, a high proportion of all these activities seems to occur on Wednesday and on the 24th of the month. This has been a stable factor throughout history. The biblical prophet Zechariah reported, Zechariah 1:7, an angelic visitation upon the 24th day of the 11th month, circa 520 BC. The most famous flying saucer sighting of modern times, that of private pilot Kenneth Arnold near Mount Rainier in Washington, occurred on June 24, 1947. Note that many of the events discussed throughout this book took place on the 24th of the month. Paranormal events also seem to duster around the 10th of the month. Early peoples were aware of these factors and linked them with the phases of the moon. They thought the full moon influenced human behavior and produced lunacy. Appearances of DFOs and assorted apparitions do seem to increase during specific periods of the lunar cycle, and as noted in Chapter 2, the human mind does seem to be involved. Many of these things have been carelessly dismissed as hallucinations because only certain people can see these things at certain times. However, a great many factors are involved. Recent studies indicate that persons of high psychic potential, who experience prophetic dreams and flashes of extrasensory perception, ESP, are more prone to see these things than people with little or no psychic ability. Polls and tests conducted over the past century by assorted scientists indicate that about 1/3 of the population possesses active or latent psychic abilities. They constitute our main body of 2 witnesses. The other 2/3 have never had any personal experiences of tin sort and so, naturally enough, dismiss AFL of this as utter rubbish. 2 independent statistical studies of available UFO reports were conducted in 1970 and confirmed that the highest number of UFO sightings took place on Wednesdays. An amateur group, the American Flying Saucer Investigating Committee of Columbus, Ohio, ran a study of 929 UFO reports from the year 1968 and found that Wednesdays produced the greatest number, 152. A more elaborate professional computer study of 7,025 sightings from years 1921 to 1969 was carried out by Dr. David Saunders of Colorado University. He too found that the greatest number of sightings, 1,077, occurred on Wednesdays. The lowest number in the Ohio study was 117 for Sundays. The lowest number in the Saunders study was 903 for Saturdays. Although these are only pilot studies and much more work along this line will be necessary before any definite conclusions can be reached, it is obvious that these things are not random and sporadic but are governed by a definite time cycle of some sort. Factors of coincidence, innocent errors, misinterpretations of ordinary aircraft and mundane natural phenomenon, weather balloons, and so on must be filtered out. Another computer study of 1,200 anomalies and unusual occurrences, sifted from the works of Charles Fort, was recently carried out by C.L. Mallows of the Bell Telephone Laboratories. Here it was found that a broader cycle of 9.6 years was seemingly involved. The conclusion is inescapable that these cycles of activity, which pass through our world like radio waves of enormous length, must have a common cause. Damon Knight explained in his book, Charles Fort, Prophet of the Unexplained. The cause of the cycles, the controlling force that keeps them in synchrony, must lie outside the Earth. The Bell study includes such diversified phenomena as skyfalls, odd objects dropping out of the sky, unusual storms, rains of frogs, etc., things observed in space, and things seen in the sky. All of these phenomena tended to occur simultaneously in specific months and specific years. The waves or cycles of these events were repeated approximately every 9.6 years. The study dealt largely with data from the 19th century. Ancient magicians and seers were quite familiar with these cyclic factors. The earnest religious and occult lore discusses rays which periodically sweep our planet from some extraterrestrial source and cause everything from miracles to sadness and catastrophes. Strangely, the Australian Aborigines, the South American Indians, and the tribes of Africa, as well as the ancient Babylonians and other early cultures, all pinpointed the Pleiades, a cluster of 7 stars, and the constellation of Orion as that source of these rays. Rays from outer space are an integral part of all human folklore. In time, all of these intangibles will be puttied down by courageous scientific investigators. Studies of this kind are still very unpopular among scientists. Already we know, or have relearned, that all paranormal manifestations have a tendency to occur in the same places year after year, that they follow specific patterns within our own time scale, that only specific people can witness or become involved in these events. The logical jumping-off place for any future investigation is to study the witnesses in depth and to explore these gateways carefully and methodically. Small groups of psychiatrists, parapsychologists, geologists, and physicists are now engaged in studies of this type. One significant factor, which is hardly a secret to the occultists, is that the window areas tend to be places where peculiar magnetic faults exist. Our haunted planet is covered with magnetic faults, and interestingly enough, many of them are grouped around the ancient mounds, temple sites, and spots where flying saucers are seen most frequently. Psychically oriented people living in these regions tend to have extraordinary experiences with elementals, angels, MEB, and spacemen. Numerous examples will be given further on. A leading authority on mythology and mysticism, poet Robert Graves, recently stated, "There are some sacred places made so by the radiation created by magnetic ores. My village, for example, is a kind of natural amphitheater enclosed by mountains containing iron ore, which makes a magnetic field. Most holy places in the world holy not by some accident, like a hero dying or being born there are of this sort. Delphi was a heavily charged holy place. Back in the Middle Ages the Vatican pointedly ordered that new churches should be constructed on the sites of old temples whenever possible. The tradition of sacred places runs deep and seems to be largely based upon the continuous observations of paranormal manifestations. The entities who allegedly approached human beings in miraculous events frequently ordered a church or temple to be built on the spot. But we didn't need an order to erect great churches at Lourdes and Fatima after the entities appeared there. Remember the legendary 19-year cycle of Stonehenge, when the god was supposed to appear. Multiply the Fortean cycle of 9.6 years by 2. A magnetic survey of the United States was carried out by the government in the 1950s. Maps detailing magnetic variations in nearly every state can be obtained from the Office of Geological Survey in Washington. Comparisons of the concentrations of paranormal manifestations with these maps show unique clusters around the magnetic aberrations. Could it be that periodic sweeps of those rays from outer space set up some kind of physical or psychic reactions in these fault areas? This is a question that could be answered scientifically, if only someone would put up the money, equipment, and personnel to make a study. We are only reobserving the things which awed early man and inspired his superstitions and beliefs. Electromagnetic energy plays a key role in these manifestations. We are still learning about it. Our planet may be constantly interchanging energy with some outside force. This exchange of energy is an important part of occult belief. It occurs, we are told, on every level. Chinese philosophers of long ago contended that man was moon food, i.e., the energy of individual souls was drained off and absorbed by some extraterrestrial force which needed such energy to replenish itself. Later, theologians extended this to form the classic explanation that we were the subjects of a war between God and the devil, a war to win the souls of man and thereby control the planet. Thus, the demons and MIB who appeared in earlier times were supposed to have been after souls. They made lavish promises, according to the records, and offered fanciful philosophies and cosmologies, but as Swedenborg figured out, they always proved to be nothing but splendid liars. Early investigators and thinkers soon realized they were dealing with magical beings who could imitate man and his works. Instead of being solid physically stable assemblages of cells and matter, these entities were apparently temporary manipulations of energy. So the word transmogrification was used to describe them. These transmogrifications, according to the lore, could assume any form, from a wolf or a cat to a house, ship, or iridescent god of awesome proportions. They could appear clothed in rags or in gold crowns and expensive velvet robes. Worst of all, they had a penchant for playing all kinds of games with us, manipulating our fears and beliefs and even conning us into going to war against each other. One alarming facet of their countless messages to percipients and contacts is their preoccupation with spreading racist propaganda. The messages recorded throughout history are filled with such propaganda. If the percipient was an Indian, the propaganda was aimed at a nearby tribe. If he was Hindu, it was directed at the Muslims. The elementals are purveyors of bait, and perhaps much of the racial prejudice blighting the human race was originally the product of their teachings. Even those wonderful space people and brothers from other planets managed to play this game. Long John Nebel, a New York radio personality, has spent thousands of hours interviewing contacts and UFO bros on the air over WNBC, and in his book, Way Out World, he offers this comment. A bit that has always bugged me is the racist propaganda which keeps cropping up from one group to another. In this area, regrettably, I'm unable to name names and cite occasions, since the allusions are always so carefully phrased so that the offenders could easily deny the intentions of their remarks. But the meaning is there, never doubt it. As is usually the case, the unfavored parties racially speaking are the Jews and Negroes, and the themes of both fascism and communism seem to echo from behind the scenes on more than a few occasions. But it's all part of the action. Some contacts who claim to have visited Mars blandly point out that the planet is divided into zones with the Negro and Jewish Martians carefully segregated from the others. Even contacts of liberal persuasions repeat with some dismay the nastily racist remarks of the Venusians. The Jews are a favorite target of this outer space propaganda, as if they haven't got enough trouble already. Until the past 5 or 6 years, racial prejudice was actually a basic part of all the Western religions. After digging down to the source of these racist beliefs, there are always the ancient teachings of dubious messengers. They have kept the human race stirred up and at each other's throats for thousands of years. Now finally the Catholics are beginning to soften their traditional anti-Semitism, and the Mormons are beginning to face the fact that Negroes ate also human beings. Aside from their inveterate racism, the mimics are also fond of exploiting tense political situations. A band of phantom Indians plagued the settlers of Gloucester, Massachusetts, back in 1692. They appeared night after night, skirmishing with the English and firing bulletless guns. Although the Indians never killed or scalped anyone, the colonists were understandably upset and heavily fortified their positions. The English became convinced that they were not real Indians, Sir Walter Scott reported, but that the devil and his agents had assumed such an appearance. The North American Indians have innumerable legends about an entity they called the trickster because he would turn up occasionally and play wild and vicious pranks. Earth's phantom inhabitants play many other roles, especially in the widely accepted sphere of psychic phenomena. Telly Savalas, the famous character actor, told Hollywood reporter Dick Kleiner a weird story involving a black Cadillac. It happened when Savalas was young and flat broke. His car ran out of gas on Long Island, and after he started walking, a black Cadillac seemed to appear from nowhere, and the driver offered him a lift. The driver was dressed entirely in white, a refreshing switch, and said very little. But at one point he offered Savalas $1 to buy some gas. The actor insisted that the nun write down his name and address on a slip of paper so he could be repaid. They found a gas station, and the driver waited while Savalas bought a can of gasoline. Then they drove back to his own car in silence. "I know Harry Agnes," the driver said suddenly. Savalas asked who Harry Agnes was. "He's a utility infielder on the Boston Red Sox," the man answered. That was the end of the conversation. The man waited while Savalas poured the gasoline into the car, gave him a push to get him started, and then drove off with a wave. The next day Savalas was shaken by newspaper headlines announcing the sudden death of Harry Agnes. He decided to call the phone number on the slip of paper given to him by the man in the white suit. It was in Massachusetts, and a woman answered. Savalas told her he wanted to speak to Bill, the name on the paper. There was a pause, and another woman came on the lyre. "I first met Bill last night," Savalas began, "and something happened, and I wanted—" "You met him last night," she interrupted, choking on sudden tears. Then she told him that her husband Bill had been dead for 3 years. Later she met with Savalas in New York and told him that her husband had been buried in a white suit. She showed him the last letter her husband had written, and how was startled to see that the handwriting exactly matched the handwriting on the slip of paper given him by the Cadillac driver. The whole fabric of psychic belief is woven from such stories, which number in the many thousands and are accepted by millions as proof of survival after death. But investigators informed in the antics of the ultra-terrestrial mimics are obliged to look deeper. These entities labor to cultivate belief in various frames of reference, and then they deliberately create new manifestations which support those beliefs. Savalas rode in a physically real Cadillac and spoke with a seemingly real man. If the incident was only a joke of some land, it was a very complicated and pointless one. Phantom campers, vehicles with built-on trailers, have been widely reported in the western states in recent years. And we have reports of phantom airplanes and helicopters by the hundreds. In the 1930s, thousands of people in Northern Europe saw formations of mysterious aeroplanes over Norway, Sweden, and Finland. Despite extensive searches by the military forces of several countries, the source of these ghost flyers, as they were called, was never determined. During World War and military intelligence groups collected a number of phantom aeroplane sightings from pilots returning from missions. Crews of several bombers from the 92nd Group reported the following over Germany. 4 P-47s, thought to be friendly American aircraft flown by the enemy, were observed on the approach to the initial point at 22,000 feet, heading 120 degrees magnetic. These aircraft flew out to the side and parallel with the combat wing formation in the manner of fighter escort. They suddenly executed a 90 degrees turn in towards the head of the combat wing formation. These aircraft were originally at 800 yards on port beam. They approached to 300 yards, when they nosed up and away, showing a full plan view of themselves. Positive identification is claimed. The aircraft had brown fuselages, and the wings were a very dark color, almost black. No white cowling and no white tail markings were observed. No insignia was observed, and the aircraft did not open fire. Several B-17s fired on them. The last P-47 escort had long since departed, and the enemy aircraft had been attacking for some time at this point. The opening theory expressed in this intelligence report, 4 P-47s, thought to be friendly American aircraft flown by the enemy, was proven invalid. The mystery planes did not fire at the American bombers, but were fired on instead. If the Germans had attempted such a ploy with captured aircraft, they certainly would have painted appropriate insignia on the planes. And after having succeeded in getting within 300 yards of the bombers, the pilots, if they were German, would certainly have opened fire. Instead, they scooted away, never to be seen again. Low-flying mystery aeroplanes reported in 1969 to 70 were most often described as resembling P-38s, the twin-engined, dual-fuselage fighters used in the Pacific in World War II. They were fast, noisy aircraft, but our mystery planes move very slowly and in complete silence. They execute impossible maneuvers, such as sudden right-angle turns, and disappear as mysteriously as they had come. Only 3 handful of P-38s are still operational, and they were not the culprits in these cases. Like the ghost flyers of 1934, they are a dull gray and violate all regulations by failing to show any license numbers or insignia. Could these phantom aircraft be part and parcel of the same phenomena which produce phantom automobiles and campers? Could they also be apparitions and transmogrifications of energy that can be properly categorized with the disappearing Indians of Gloucester? The evidence suggests that this could very well be the case. In other ages, flying ships were sometimes reported. Flying Saucer Review, May-June 1970, reprinted a fascinating story from 1743. A farmer near Pybio, Wales, claimed he had seen a flying sailboat that year. He estimated that it was about 1,500 feet in the air and could have been about 90 tons. The keel of the ship was plainly seen, thus ruling out mirages of ships far out to sea. Similar phenomena had been reported in the same area about 10 years previous. Fairy lore is also filled with alleged sightings of fairy ships complete with billowing sails. Our problem is compounded by these amazing, confusing, and alas, scientifically inadmissible subjective observations. The UFO cults have solved this dilemma by simply throwing out this ident of material and concentrating only on those reports which describe circular of cigar-shaped objects. We must, however, consider all the forms reported with equal care if we are to arrive at any valid conclusions. There is no way to investigate a flying saucer after it has flown. But it is possible to study the people who saw it and the terrain over which it appeared. If we are dealing with clever mimics and transmogrifications of energy, and if man has been observing these things throughout his history, then the real clues may be found in the thousands of volumes in all languages describing those observations and encounters. One basic fact should be obvious from the foregoing: these entities and things are not necessarily from some other planet. They are actually closely tied to the human race, are a part of our immediate environment in some unfathomable fashion, and to a very large extent are primarily concerned with misleading us, misinforming us, and playing games with us. These mysterious members of the Welsh Eonwings over the world are our benefactors and our enemies. They educate us and they torment us. They have given us hope, guided our religions and philosophies, and watched us crawl out of the cares and build rockets to the moon. They may have watched other civilizations come and go. They may have sincerely helped us to preserve the memories of those lost ages and those past mistakes. Or it all may be rubbish, and we may be nothing more than the pawns with which they play their mischievous games. Theologians and philosophers have always been troubled by the nearly impossible task of sorting the real from the unreal, the truth from the false. Perhaps the only workable criterion is the ancient one of judging them by their works. Chapter 9. Men in Black lore and the CIA. There is no truth to the rumors that the flying saucers are from Spain, or that they are piloted by Spaniards, General Carl Spaatz, Air Force Chief of Staff, told a press conference in 1948. This was an astonishing statement, since a review of all the UFO literature and the fan magazines of the period has failed to uncover such a rumor. It suggests that people must have been reporting slight, dark-complexioned pilots to the Air Force back in 1948, long before the UFO buffs started taking flying saucer occupant sightings seriously. In his detailed report on the Maury Island UFO hoax of 1947, Kenneth Arnold also describes meeting a small, dark, foreign-looking man who was tinkering with the motor on a beat-up boat in Tacoma Harbor. Ray Palmer, editor of Amazing Stories in Chicago, had commissioned Arnold to investigate the puzzling Maury Island affair, which began when a donut-shaped object had rained slag onto a boat near Maury Island. Pieces of that slag had killed a dog aboard the boat and slightly injured a boy, the son of Harold Dahl, who was piloting it. Early the next morning, according to Dahl's story, a 1947 Buick drove up to his home and a black-suited man of medium height visited him. This man, Dahl said, recited in detail everything that had happened the day before as if he had been there. Then he warned Dahl not to discuss his sighting with anyone, hinting that if he did there might be unpleasant repercussions which would affect him and his family. Since Dahl and the others had not yet told anyone of their sighting, and since UFOs were still publicly unknown, Arnold's sighting over Mount Rainier and the attendant publicity did not occur until 3 days later. Dahl was naturally nonplussed by his strange visitor. This was the first modern MIB report. Dahl's boss, Fred L. Chrisman, he also owned the boat, became a central figure in the mystery. Dahl himself vanished soon after his interview with Arnold, and efforts by later investigators such as Harold Wilkins, a British author, have failed to locate him. Chrisman had been a flyer in World War II, and he was suddenly recalled into the service in 1947, flown to Alaska, and later stationed in Greenland. In recent years, the amateur sleuths engaged in investigating the alleged conspiracy to assassinate President John F. Kennedy have tried to implicate Chrisman. District Attorney James Garrison of New Orleans subpoenaed one Fred Lee Chrisman of Tacoma, Washington, to testify before the grand jury, listening to Garrison's evidence against Clay Shaw, according to Wire Service Stories in November 1963. Chrisman was identified as a radio announcer, but Garrison's investigators implied that he was either a member of the CIA or had been engaged in undercover activity for a part of the industrial warfare complex. He allegedly operated under a cover as a preacher and was engaged in work to help gypsies. These stories caused a chain reaction in UFO circles, since UFO believers have long accused the CIA of being somehow connected with the flying saucer mystery. Of course, the CIA was in its infancy in 1947 at the time of the Maury Island case, and was then largely staffed by naval personnel from World War I intelligence units. Clay Shaw was tried early in 1969, accused by Garrison of having conspired to murder President Kennedy. He was found innocent and freed. The exact nature of Chrisman's testimony before the grand jury is not known. He did not testify at the actual trial. When Ray Palmer, one of the best-informed urologists extant, summarized his own theories about the Maury Island mystery in the book he co-authored with Arnold, The Coming of the Saucers, he asked pointedly, "Was the Tacoma affair a hoax?" Whose? In recent years, many seemingly solid flying saucer cases have dissolved in confusion under close investigation. Often they appear to be outrageous hoaxes perpetrated by some mysterious third party, although the general tendency is to blame the innocent witnesses. These bizarre hoaxes are often identical to the mischievous fairy hoaxes and games of an earlier epoch. The Maury Island case fell apart in Arnold's hands. The slag samples given to him by Dahl and Chrisman were switched by someone. 2 investigating Air Force officers, Brown and Davidson, were killed when their plane crashed shortly after leaving Tacoma. Dahl vanished. Chris Ron was literally exiled to Greenland for 2 years. Tacoma newsman Paul Lance, who helped Arnold in his investigation, died suddenly a short time later. Palmer claims that a cigar box filled with original slag samples was stolen from his Chicago office soon afterwards. At one point, Ted Morello of the United Press took Arnold aside and told him, "You're involved in something that is beyond our power here to find out anything about. We tried to find out information at McCord Field, the Tacoma Air Force Base, and drew a Wade, and we have informants there who practically smell the runways for news. We've exhausted every avenue attempting to piece what has happened together so it makes some sense. I'm just going to give you some sound advice. Get out of this town until whatever it is blows over." Arnold got into his private plane and headed for home. He stopped in Pendleton, Oregon, to refuel, and shortly after he took off again. His engine stopped cold. Only quick thinking and expert flying saved him from a serious crash. Despite the statements of General Spaatz and Kenneth Arnold in 1947-48, slight, dark-skinned men did not really begin to appear in published UFO reports until around 1954. There were, however, descriptions of dark, or heavily suntanned, UFO occupants as far back as 1897. The Men in Black phenomenon did not really grip the UFO field until the early 1950s. A pioneer ufologist, Albert K. Bender of Bridgeport, Connecticut, gave the MIB mystery new impetus when he suddenly closed down his International Flying Saucer Bureau in 1953, vaguely hinting that 3 men in black suits had terrorized him into abandoning his research. Other UFO researchers studied his guarded remarks and concluded that he had been pressured out of business by sinister agents of the government. 3 years later, Gray Barker, a UFO investigator in West Virginia, published They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, a book which dealt with numerous MIB stories from as far away as New Zealand. The Bender case was the cornerstone of Barker's theory that the MIB either represented some governmental authority employing questionable methods to silence UFO researchers, or that a more fantastic sponsorship is responsible for their deeds. Many of these dark-skinned, Oriental-featured gentlemen visited UFO witnesses wearing Air Force uniforms. This fact and the vast quantity of reported visits quickly led the UFO buffs to believe that their enemy was indeed the U.S. Air Force. Soon the UFO believers and their organizations were devoting most of their time, energy, and money to investigating the Air Force and, as the paranoia mounted, to investigating each other. The popular books of Donald E. Keyhoe, a retired Marine Corps pilot, were largely concerned with the alleged Air Force and governmental conspiracy to hide the truth about flying saucers from the public. Other UFO writers of the late 1950s followed Keyhoe's example, and this monumental conspiracy became one of the main facts of ufology. 10 years after he suddenly withdrew from UFO research, albeit K. Bender released his full story, Flying Saucers and the Three Men, which was privately published by Gray Barker. It proved to be far more unbelievable than any of the speculations. He claimed that he had been visited by dark-skinned gentlemen with glowing eyes, who materialized and dematerialized in his apartment. On one occasion, he said, he had been transported to a secret UFO base in Antarctica, where he had been told the secret. The UFOs were here to collect a rare and valuable element from the Earth's oceans. The project would be completed in the early 1960s, he was told, and then the flying saucers would leave our planet, and he would be free to write about his experiences. Bender's revelations made no sense to the UFO coterie, since few of them were acquainted with demonology and the fairy myths of the Middle Ages. They did not realize that his purported experiences followed classic patterns. In addition to his interest in flying saucers, Bender had also been involved in a study of black magic, and black magic, as we shall soon see, has always been a major method for conjuring up elementals. He had been plagued by odors of sulfur and strange poltergeistic manifestations during the period of the visitations. He also suffered certain medical effects, such as chronic headaches and lapses of memory, which are common symptoms of the contactee syndrome. The UFO buffs quickly branded Bender a nut who was trying to get rich from flying saucers. Actually, his book sold only a few thousand copies to the UFO hardcore and made him the subject of considerable criticism and ridicule. Countless MIB-type stories have now been collected and published by UFO investigators all over the world. Even the stuffy anti-UFO report of Colorado University, a study which had been commissioned by the Air Force in 1967, discussed a few cases. Case number 52 of the report occupies 18 pages and discusses in detail the strange experiences of a Santa Ana, California highway inspector named Rex Heflin, who took a series of Polaroid photographs of a circular object near a Marine Corps airfield on August 3, 1965. He had copies made of these pictures, fortunately, and turned over the originals to two men who claimed to represent the North American Air Defense Command, NORAD. Later NORAD officials emphatically denied that any of their personnel had visited Heflin, and the original photos have never been located. 2 years later, soon after scientists from Colorado University began their investigation of the Heflin case, he received another group of strange visitors. They appeared at his home at dusk on Wednesday, October 11, 1967, dressed in Air Force uniforms. Because of his earlier experience, Heflin inspected their credentials carefully and wrote down their names and other information. They questioned him about the photos and asked him if he knew anything about the Bermuda Triangle, an area where many planes and ships have vanished. During the questioning, the witness says he noted a car parked in the street with indistinct lettering on the front door, the Colorado report states. In the back seat could be seen a figure in violet, not blue, glow, which the witness attributed to instrument dials. He believed he was being photographed or recorded. In the meantime, his FM multiples radio was playing in the living room, and during the questioning it made several loud audible pops. Dr. James E. McDonald, a meteorologist from the University of Arizona, and other investigators later tried to check out the identity of these visitors. Again, they drew a complete blank. Despite their credentials and uniforms, these men were apparently imposters. Numerous other witnesses have also reported visits from men in big black cars, usually Cadillacs, with peculiar purplish glows lighting their interiors. There are even a number of witnesses who claim to have been temporarily kidnapped in such automobiles. They have described strange psychedelic lights on the dashboards which caused them to fall into hypnotic trances. Some of these phantom vehicles have a special insignia printed on their doors, a triangle with a bolt of lightning passing through it. In other cases, witnesses said the symbol was the classic triangle with an eye, the ancient symbol for the deity, and the MIP identified themselves as agents for the Nation of the Third Eye. Such stories are rarely given wide circulation and are almost never published. So it is quite interesting that so many far-flung witnesses managed to come up with the same identical details. One of the first clues that a UFO flap was about to break on Long Island in the spring of 1967 was a series of random reports describing strange oriental or gypsy-like entities parading across people's lawns in the middle of the night. One man living on an isolated farm near Melville, New York, said he saw a metallic disc hovering a few feet above one of his fields in broad daylight. A ladder was hanging down from it, he said, and as he watched, it was retraced into the object, and the whole thing flew off soundlessly. A few days later he answered a knock on his door and was surprised to see a gypsy lady standing there. She was dressed in a long gray gown and wore sandals. Her skin was a deep olive and her eyes had an oriental cast. She was about 5 feet 4 inches tall, and her hair was long and so black that it looked dyed. "I have traveled a long way," she said in a low, accented voice. "May I have a glass of water? I must take a pill." He gave her the water, and she took a round green pill, thanked him, and left. He was puzzled that there was no car in sight. He lived on an isolated back road, and visitors, especially visitors traveling by foot, are very rare. "I have traveled a long way" is an old Masonic passphrase and is frequently used in these contacts. Sometimes the simple phrase, "What time is it?" or "What is your time?" is substituted. The pill-taking ploy is also a common procedure. When a most peculiar being visited a family on Cape May, New Jersey, early in 1967, B also took a pill. He too had traveled a long way, and after conducting an inane interview with the family, he stepped into the night, got into a black Cadillac, and drove off with the lights out. A full summary of this case was published in Flying Saucer Review's second special issue. A woman living in an old house on the summit of a high hill in the Melville, New York area had a visit from a strange quartet around the same time that the gypsy lady dropped in on the farmer. 4 Indians appeared on her doorstep after a heavy seasonal rainfall. 3 of them were stately, dark-skinned, with pointed faces and oriental features. They were dressed in expensively cut gray suits. The 4th man looked different, more normal, she said, and was poorly dressed in a frayed black jacket. They told her that their tribe had originally owned her property, and they were going to try to get it back. What frightened the woman most, and she was frightened she admitted later, was that there was no mud on their neatly shined shoes, and they had no car in sight. The road and her lawn were soupy with mud at the time. After they left, she realized they had left no footprints on her lawn. In case after case, amateur UFO investigators have rejected the testimony of sincere witnesses who claim to have seen UFOs land and entities dismount, because no footprints could be found on the site afterwards. At 1:30 a.m. on Wednesday, March 1, 1967, a man named DeWitt Baldwin was hunting near Eden, New York when, according to his story, he heard a funny noise and saw a circular gold-colored object land. "I was scared. I didn't know what to do," Baldwin said. "While I was watching it, a door opened, like a sliding elevator door, and a man walked out and down the incline of the machine. He was dressed in a sort of black tight-fitting suit like a flyer and had on some sort of helmet and goggles. He asked me what I was doing. He wasn't white, and he wasn't a Negro. He talked very plainly with no accent. I told him I was hunting. He asked me if I was born here, and I said no, that I was born in Georgia. He took my gun, looked at it, and handed it back to me. He told me he would be back, walked up the saucer, got in, and seconds later zipped out of sight. Mr. Baldwin found a crack in the muzzle of Ms. shotgun after the man had examined it. Neither the object nor the pilot left any marks in the fresh snow. Local UFO investigators regarded this as proof that Mr. Baldwin had fabricated his story and was merely seeking notoriety. An Iowa College professor who writes popular books under the pseudonym of Brad Steiger has been investigating men in black cases in the Midwest for several years. In his book, Flying Saucer Invasion, he disclosed another common MIB tactic which is being widely employed these days to discredit investigators. Steiger wrote, in the summer of 1968, Brad Steiger received a long-distance telephone call from a journalist friend who was covering a UFO flap for his local newspaper. Steiger wrote in the third person. Blast Brad Steiger and Joan Rittenauer, a Florida researcher who collaborated with Steiger, and down with John Keel, he thundered. Steiger, recognizing his friend's voice, asked him what the trouble was. I'm trying to cover this flap over here, my lordle. Everyone has seen these UFOs low, but every time I try to dig deep, the eyewitness clams up and says, I won't say more. Brad Steiger says awful things will happen to me if I tell too much. One lady said that John Keel had told her that she would be carried off by the saucer people if she talked to anyone about her sighting. Steiger knew that neither he nor Keel were in that particular area at that time, and that neither he nor Keel would say such things in even a jesting manner if they had been in the locale, so he pressed his friend for details. Well, damn near everywhere I go the witness has been given a copy of one of the Steiger-Rittenauer books or a magazine with an article in it by you or Keel. And the books and articles are supposed to frighten them? Steiger questioned. Whoever is delivering these things must be adding their own interpretation. Who are the delivery boys? Have you seen them? Not until this afternoon, the newsman answered. I guess I arrived at this farmhouse just a few minutes after they did. Damn unfriendly little monkeys. I was trying to talk to the farmer's wife, while they were chattering at the and waving a copy of this magazine in their hands and telling the man how Brad Steiger was warning all UFO sighters not to talk. Could you describe them? They were short men in dark suits. All three of them had deep suntans. I can't recall even seeing their eyes. Come to think of it, they all wore dark glasses. Small wonder there's so much paranoia in the UFO field. These mystery men have posed as Air Force officers, well-known investigators, and members of the amateur UFO organizations, deliberately sowing confusion and fear in their wake. There are even reliable reports describing entities who resembled exactly the men they were imitating, doppelgangers. On several occasions these doppelgangers have visited witnesses who had been previously interviewed by the author, creating considerable confusion. The Colorado University study tried to shrug off the Heflin photos because of the internal inconsistencies in his story, his visits from non-existent military officers. Similar episodes have led to extended feuds between amateur investigators and groups, each believing that the other has been warning witnesses not to talk to them. In many of these episodes the MIB appear on the scene immediately after the sightings, before the witness has had a chance to report it to anyone. They often flourish an identification card and announce they are from Washington or the CIA. Any real CIA agent who went around openly identifying himself as such would soon be standing in an unemployment line. When they use the Air Force ploy, they have the uncanny ability to use the name of an existing officer, but they change their rank. Thus a Colonel Higgins may turn up in a flap area where an actual sergeant named Higgins is stationed nearby. Adding to the nonsense and confusion, we have the dreary face that ufology has always attracted eccentric personalities, and a few, very few, of these situations have proven to be their doing. One quasi-scientific UFO group maintains an office in Washington, D.C., and some of their members are fond of waving their membership cards about authoritatively, giving the false impression that they represent a government agency. The whole mess began in Tacoma in 1947, Since then the MIB manifestations have created a body of myth and lore fingering the federal government as the sinister silencer of UFO witnesses and censor of UFO news in the press. There is no UFO censorship, as the publication of this book attests. The hardcore UFO buffs maintain these myths, however. They ignore the massive evidence found in the other frames of reference which points to the puzzling existence of the para-human mimics of man who have always been engaged in mischievous, and sometimes malicious, shenanigans. Mrs. Coral Lorenzen, who has been running the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, APRO, since 1952, devoted a chapter of her book UFOs over the Americas to the CIA's purportedly sinister interest in the subject. Her evidence was a combination of hearsay, speculation, coincidences, classic MIB manipulations, and the uneasy feeling that APRO was being watched. It is caught surprising, of course, that some of the UFO organizations have occasionally been monitored by the FBI and other agencies, since the leading proponents of UFO beliefs have made a habit of publicly attacking the government and the military establishment on radio and television. Some UFO publications do border on the subversive. In the 1950s a strong communist influence was visible, and some major groups collapsed when they turned more political than ufological. In the 1960s ufology swung in the other direction as members of the extreme right wing embraced the flying saucer cause. In 1969 the long-suffering Air Force got out of the UFO business by closing down Project Blue Book, its half-hearted flying saucer agency, thus eliminating the favorite target of the UFO cultists' wrath. Another group of CIA-baiting researchers is now overlapping into ufology. They are the comparatively small teams of amateur sleuths dedicated to investigating the assassination of President Kennedy. Here the black Cadillacs and the slight, dark men in black suits are viewed as Cubans and CIA agents. Paranoia runs high because now over 50 witnesses, reporters, and assassination investigators have met with sudden death, some under the most suspicious circumstances. The full story of Kennedy's murder in Dallas in 1963 is filled with incredible details, many of them similar to things found in the most mysterious of the UFO incidents. Photos and physical evidence have vanished or been tampered with just as in so many UFO cases. A wide assortment of mystery men have been involved, including doppelgangers of the late Lee Harvey Oswald. This other Oswald even turned up at a public rifle range before the assassination. The second Oswald, making a nuisance of himself, so the witnesses would be sure to remember him, as he fired an unusual gun which spat out balls of fire at the target. He also visited an automobile showroom and went for a demonstration ride in a new car. The real Oswald could not drive. His whereabouts at the time of these incidents are known, and he was nowhere near the rifle range and auto agency. The huge Warren report contains numerous pieces of sworn testimony describing MIB-type men in the vicinity of Dealer Plaza and the school book depository building immediately before and after the assassination. Long-haired men were seen. This may not sound extraordinary, but remember that long hair was most unusual in 1963. The Beatles did not begin to make an impression until 1964, and the long hair fad did not get underway until 1965-66. Elemental hairstyles have always been on the longish side, as we have already noted. The UFO lore is filled with accounts of pilots with angular faces and long, shoulder-length hair, usually blonde, just as the gods, demons, and angels of earlier times sported long hair. Another interesting consistency is the unnatural color of their hair, so unnatural that witnesses often comment on it. The late MRS Mary Hyre, a newspaper reporter in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, received visits from strange personages soon after she began to write about local UFO sightings. Two of these strangers had long, silver hair, she said. They were young men, and I couldn't understand why they had dyed their hair such a funny color. MRS Hyre also claimed encounters with darkly tanned, soberly dressed gentlemen who rode up to her office in black Cadillacs. One of them asked her what she would do if someone ordered her to stop publishing UFO reports. "I'd tell them to go to hell," was her reply. Jerome Clark, one of America's leading ufologists, has his own theory about the present trend towards long hair. For a long time, contacts and their followers talked freely of the New Age, while the rest of us merely sneered. Clark wrote in Flying Saucer Review, September-October, 1970, "Now there is considerable talk, even a popular song, about the coming of the Aquarian Age. One of the features of the New Age, as contacts predicted years ago, is the revival of interest in the occult, astrology, the tarot, palmistry, telepathy, spiritualism, magic, witchcraft, the Ouija board, and so on. Also involved, of course, are such obvious features as changes in clothing and hairstyles. On basic strategic grounds it is easier now for them to walk in our midst unnoticed. A long-haired blonde male, for example, would now attract little if any attention in the streets of most good-sized Western cities, nor would strange behavior patterns be any particular cause for alarm in a culture born of nonconformity. There are millions of people today who do believe that Venusians, Martians, angels, and demons are walking among us unnoticed, their long hair and peculiar dress and manners no longer attracting attention. Strange men in black turtleneck sweaters and wrap-around sunglasses, a favorite garb of our MIB, are being reported everywhere. The black Cadillacs are on the prowl. Have we been invaded by beings from outer space or from some other space-time continuum as so many now believe, or is it that we are just beginning to notice the funny folk who have been in our midst all along? In any case, it is understandable that so many researchers and investigators double-bolt their doors at night and spend their days peering fearfully over their shoulders. Chapter 10. Rendezvous with the Damned. Sometime around the year AD 421, a group of artisans from a now lost civilization painstakingly engraved a series of gold leaves or plates with cryptic symbols and buried them in a stone box on the west side of a hill near what is now the village of Manchester, New York. They remained there, unknown and untouched, for 1400 years. Then on Friday, September 21, 1821, an 18-year-old farm boy named Joseph Smith awoke to a vision in his bedroom near Palmyra, New York. A personage appeared, he said later, standing in the air, for his feet did not touch the floor. This being was dressed in a long robe of most exquisite whiteness, was surrounded by light, and his countenance was truly like light ring. He identified himself as Moroni, a messenger sent from the presence of God, called the youth by name, and announced that he had been chosen for a special task. In subsequent appearances, Moroni gave Joseph Smith the exact location of the box and told him that he was to dig it up when instructed to do so. 6 years passed before Smith received word to unearth the tablets. The date was September 22, 1827. That night the skies were aflame with a spectacular display of meteors, falling stars, and luminous spheres. One of the many witnesses was another young man who lived in northern New York but was unacquainted with Joseph Smith. His name was Brigham Young. Smith dug into the hillside, found the box exactly as Moroni had said, pried the ed, and discovered the gold plates along with crystalline devices which became known as the Urim and Thummim. He spent the next 3 years translating the strange writing, although he had little formal education, purportedly with the aid of the lens-like objects. 11 of his friends and neighbors signed formal affidavits swearing they had viewed the plates. But once they had been translated, the gold plates vanished. The messenger called for them, Smith explained. In March 1830 the translation was published by a local printer. It was the Book of Mormon, a history of ancient North America. The following month the Mormon Church was officially organized with 6 members in Fayette, New York. Today it has over 2.5 million followers. Joseph Smith was murdered by a hostile mob in Carthage, Illinois, in June 1844. Brigham Young became the leader of the harassed band of Mormons who worked their way across the country until they arrived at the rather inhospitable wasteland around the Great Salt Lake in Utah. In 1848, many of the Mormons were dismayed by Young's choice for the site of their future city. But a year later the California gold rush began and the gold-mad hordes charging westward all paused at Salt Lake City for supplies. Within a short time the city was prospering, and many of the Mormons became rich overnight. This is essentially the history, and the legend, O Pound the Mormons. The controversy which raged around the authenticity of the Book of Mormon and its teachings is too complicated to discuss here. The point is this: there is enough evidence to believe that a specter, a vision, or an angel visited Joseph Smith, or else he ascertained the location of those plates by some psychic ability, or by pure accident. And wouldn't it be interesting if the story were entirely true? If the elementals, ultraterrestrials, or some other force did select Joseph Smith, passed along the information about the plates J and engineered the formation of the Mormon religion? All of our great religions were founded in almost the same way. Muhammad, AD 570 to 632, was just an Arab tradesman until at the age of 40 he began to have visions and conversations with messengers, which led him to organize the Muslim religion and write the Quran. More recent religions, such as the Seventh-day Adventists and Jehovah's Witnesses, were established by men who claimed communication with supernatural beings and often issued amazing prophecies which came true. Throughout history, common men have had uncommon experiences which have changed them instantly and in many cases even changed the whole fabric of the period in which they lived. A Jewish tent maker named Saul was once on the road to Damascus to help suppress the rise of Christianity when, according to tradition, a blinding light appeared in the sky, and a voice converted him on the spot. He became Saint Paul. Two groups or forces have always been involved in this cosmic charade. Early man quickly learned to separate them into the good, pre-human, and evil, anti-human, and gave each new god and demon a name. In the interests of clarity, we shall label the good guys the Alpha group and the bad guys the Omega group. The Alpha group gave man a set of ethics and moral principles, while the Omega group fostered racism, greed, and violence. As time passed, the two groups began imitating each other's tactics, and the task of discriminating between them became impossibly difficult. In his confusion, man soon began to associate everything that happened around him to one of the groups. Natural catastrophes and accidents were automatically blamed on the Omega group. This led to the development of pure superstition and the awesome, irrational fear of all ultraterrestrials. Things reached a peak in the Middle Ages. Then every new and radical invention was regarded as an invention of the devil, and men such as Galileo, who came up with new scientific discoveries running contrary to the accepted cosmological view, were jailed or burned at the stake. The Omega group delighted in spreading false interpretations of the universe and false religious teachings. For every Buddha and Muhammad there were 10,000 Cyrus Teeds. Who was Cyrus Teed? He believed that the universe was a sphere and that the earth was hollow and that we live on the inside of it. Born in 1839, Teed took up the study of alchemy in Ithaca, New York, and at the age of 30 he received his first visit from a beautiful female entity who materialized in his laboratory. Following the pattern of such contacts, she first informed him of his past incarnations. He had been mighty kings and great men in past lives, naturally. No one ever approached by these entities has ever been identified as of lesser station. Then she proceeded to give him a detailed history of the cosmos, complete with her own special terminology which, of course, he adopted. He began to write pamphlets and books on this new cellular cosmogony, became a powerful public speaker, and gradually built a following for his profitable Koreshan cult. He used the pseudonym Korsh. He settled finally in Fort Myers, Florida, where he established his New Jerusalem with about 200 followers. He died in 1908 of injuries resulting from an altercation with the local sheriff. Teed had promised that he would rise again after death. He was buried in a concrete tomb on the island of Estero, and a violent hurricane carried his tomb off in 1921. His body was never recovered. This event gave the Koreshan cult new impetus, and it survived into the 1940s. Teedic ideas permeate the thousands of books written in every language by percipients and contacts. He proposed, for example, the existence of a supersoon which served as the ultimate source of the universe. Albert K. Bender claimed that the space people described this central body to him also. Many variations of this concept exist in the literature. Long before Albert Einstein published his famous theory of relativity in 1905. Einsteinian ideas were being expounded by the ultraterrestrials and published by enthused percipients. The Big Bang theory currently in favor with leading astronomers is that the universe began when all matter condensed into a single enormous body, which then exploded. The fragments of that explosion, including our own solar system, are now hurtling outwards from the center at tremendous velocity, but eventually they will follow the curvature of space as envisioned by Einstein and return to reform a new central body. Then the whole cycle will start over again. Teed and his ilk have been talking about this same thing in their own peculiar way for centuries. Scientists and doctors who have examined people claiming visions and visits with ultraterrestrials have been puzzled by their apparent normality. In many cases the percipients have seemed too unintelligent, unimaginative, uneducated, and too sincere to have simply invented the complicated, profusely detailed stories they relate. The contactee syndrome is not a form of insanity, but insanity, particularly paranoid schizophrenia, frequently develops after the contacts begin. Investigators, however, are still debating which came first in some cases, insanity or contact. The first complete psychological study of a percipient took place in the 1890s, when Theodore Flournoy, a professor of psychology at the University of Geneva, investigated the strange phenomena surrounding a girl known as Helene Smith. Beginning in March 1892, Miss Smith started to receive messages through automatic writing, a process in which the percipient merely holds the pen, and some other force moves it. Soon she was going into trances and speaking in a man's voice with an Italian accent. He identified himself as Leopold and proved to be something of a rascal, prefacing his communications with phrases such as, "I am here. I wish to be master of this sitting." Then all kinds of poltergeist-y activity would begin. Later, however, Victor Hugo, the deceased author, came through the medium and offered advice on how to handle the evil Leopold. The clash between Leopold and Victor Hugo escalated into a classic ultraterrestrial game, just as the modern UFO contacts are caught up in the games waged between the spacemen and the evil men in black. Then at 3:15 am, on the morning of September 5, 1896, Helene woke up and had a strange vision. She viewed, she said, a foreign landscape with a beautiful blue-pink lake whose shores were joined by a transparent bridge. A crowd of peculiar people approached the bridge. A man of dark complexion carrying an instrument somewhat resembling a carriage lantern in appearance, which, being pressed, emitted flames and which seemed to be a flying machine, stood on the center of the bridge. Using this instrument, he flew off the bridge, touched the water, and flew bait again. By the end of that September the dark Caucasian man had become a part of Helene's life. He appeared and disappeared suddenly when she was alone and fully conscious. Often he spoke to her in a strange unknown tongue. His name was Aston, and he was from Mars, he told her soberly. He looked more an Oriental or last Indian. On a number of occasions he guided her to his home on Mars, at least in her visions and hallucinations. Usually he was dressed in beautifully embroidered robes. Miss Smith described at length the vehicles on Mars, stating they had neither wheels nor horses, and people seemed to fly about in them. Helene quickly learned to speak the strange Martian language. Her automatic writing also developed a new twist. She began writing in unknown symbols but was able to decipher them and translate Martian into French. These symbols had the Oriental characteristics which have been so often described by modem flying saucer contacts who claim to have been aboard the craft. In later periods Helene would sometimes lapse into this language in the course of normal conversation without realizing she was doing so. It was not, Auernois noted, the kind of gibberish that children make up when they are playing at being Chinese or Indian. It was an actual language which could be broken down and studied. Other Martians turned up answering to the names of Rami and Esinal. Soon Helene's world was peopled with strange beings with long hair and long fingers, both common characteristics of the UFO entities described by contacts, who led her off on spiritual trips to other planets. On November 2, 1898, Helene reported rising at 6:15 am and feeling an invisible arm clasp itself about her waist. I then saw myself surrounded by a rose-colored light which generally shows itself when a Martian vision is coming, she said. She found herself suddenly in a section of country peopled by men altogether different from those who inhabit our globe. The tallest of all were 3 feet high, and the majority were an inch or 2 shorter. Their hands were immense, about 10 inches long by 8 inches broad. They were ornamented with very long black nails. Their feet were also of great size. These little men of 1898 resided in simple houses, all low, long, without windows or doors, and each house had a little tunnel about 10 feet long running from it into the earth. The roofs were flat, supplied with chimneys or tubes. All of the things described in Flowery's 447-page study, From India to the Planet Mars, published in 1900, have been repeated endlessly in the occult and UFO literature in other cases. The little men have since earned a special place in flying saucer lore. Flournoy speculated that Leopold Eneston could have been the same entity in different guises. Perhaps he was aware of Swedenborg's warning centuries earlier that the ultraterrestrials could assume any identity, and more interestingly, if the percipient accepted their identity, they would eventually believe themselves that they were Moses, Napoleon, or Eneston. Joseph Smith and his friends were treated with visits not only from Moroni but also from entities claiming to be John the Baptist and the apostles Peter, James, and John. Our ultraterrestrials are ham actors who delight in assuming roles and adopting names from ancient mythology. Early theologians were kept busy recording the endless names of angels and demons. Numbers are also flourished indiscriminately in both religious and contactee literature. The Bible contains long chapters giving elaborate but seemingly meaningless measurements. In OSP, a book produced by Automatic Writing in 1880, we learn that Egypt had a population of 13 million at the tune of Moses' birth. 4 million of these were enslaved Hebrews. Today Egypt's population is about 40 million, not much of an increase in 2,000 years. Page after page in OSP lists the total number of spirits and angels and druids, the OSP word for the Auriga group. This numbers game has been extended to the modern UFO phenomena. On August 7, 1965, 3 prominent men in Venezuela were present at a UFO landing and had a conversation with 2 tall, 7 to 8 feet, beings with long yellow hair, large penetrating eyes, and one-piece metallic coverall-type garments. The witnesses, who included a well-known Venezuelan doctor, claimed they communicated through telepathy, and among the questions they asked was, "Are there any beings like you living among us?" "Yes," came the reply. 2,417,805. That's a very précis answer. But many other contacts have thought to ask the same question, and the answers are wildly variable, from 75 to 10,000, in the city of Los Angeles alone, to up in the millions. Our long-haired friends also indulge in nonsensical prophecy on a grand scale. Asked when the world is going to end, they are apt to give a precise date in the near future. Some people have actually started building arks on their say-so. One group in Denmark erected a hasty atom bomb shelter in 1967 and settled down to await Armageddon that December. Who is going to be elected president in the next election? The Elemental announce with grave authority that Frank Sinatra or Mae West is in line for the job. The study of glossolalia has had a small group of scholarly followers for years. This is the attempted translation of the mysterious language, spoken by the ultraterrestrials, mediums, and church groups who indulge in speaking in tongues. It seems to be a conglomerate of many languages, both ancient and modern, and Flournoy wasn't the first to try to unravel it. There are books filled with symbols and translations similar to, but never exactly like, Helene Smith's Martian language. Dozens of these phony alphabets have been published in Dead Seriousness. A retired teacher named John W. Dean collected the testimony of flying saucer contacts and the elaborate information passed along by the space people for his book, Flying Saucers Close Up. The project must have taken years. He devotes many pages to listing unknown planets far out in the cosmos as described by the ultraterrestrials, and giving encyclopedic data about each one. But anyone with a basic knowledge of orbital mechanics and a slide rule can check the mass of figures and discover that many of these alleged planetary systems are quite impossible. The cosmos of the ultra-terrestrials must be filled with colliding planets weaving and spinning in defiance of all the known laws of motion. In Flying Saucers Close-Up, Mr. Dean also presents a complete vocabulary and the written language of the folks from the planet called Corendor. Some of the symbols bear a striking resemblance to runic ciphers. His book is only a minor example of the privately published material circulated to about 2,000 hardcore flying saucer believers. Over the past 20 years, the ultra-terrestrials have constructed a whole fantasy world through the contacts, a cosmos which includes great intergalactic councils. As soon as we grow up, we may be permitted to join. On other levels, in different frames of reference, believers speak in terms of other planes. The most common belief shared by every culture on this planet is that there are 7 distinct worlds or realities. We live on the lowest rung of the ladder. If there is a hell, we must be living in it. Numerous religious sects are concerned with Holy Ghost apparitions and the speaking in tongues phenomenon, which they accept as verification of their beliefs. The United Pentecostal Church, for example, finds great meaning in such manifestations, and they occur constantly within the church. Church bulletins and publications are filled with accounts of these events. The newsletter, Global Witness, June-July 1970, described the following, as reported by a group in Peru. On April 28, as they were praying, the 10-year-old daughter suddenly went into what they thought was a fit of convulsions. She began to jerk and shake all over. Her terrified mother rushed to her side to attempt to help her daughter, but an unseen hand restrained her, and a voice urged her to leave the girl alone. In just a few moments, this little girl, who did not know what the Holy Ghost was, began to speak in a strange but lovely new language. The following Tuesday night, the oldest boy was marvelously filled with the Holy Ghost. He rejoiced in the Spirit and spoke with tongues for over an hour. Convulsive seizures are common to all the frames of reference. Many UFO contacts suffer chronic headaches, muscular soreness, and other symptoms of such seizures after their experiences. These fits could be caused by some disorder of the frontal lobe. Primitive peoples usually regarded such fits as demonic possessions. One of the world's foremost psychologists, the late Dr. Carl G. Jung, examined the pseudo-religious aspects of the UFO rumors and published a shrewd analysis. Flying Saucers, a modern myth of things seen in the sky, in 1959. He correlated the UFO reports with psychic manifestations and suggested that the phenomena were products of the collective consciousness of mankind. The psychic aspect plays so great a role that it cannot be left out of account, Dr. Jung stated. One discussion of it leads to psychological problems which involve just as fantastic possibilities or impossibilities as the approach from the physical side. Another scientist, Dr. Jacques Vallée, an astronomer and computer specialist, spent several years sifting UFO accounts and comparing them with the earlier fairy lore of Europe. He felt that the two phenomena shared a single cause. In Passport to Magonia 1, Vallée offered a catalogue of 923 flying saucer landings from 1868 to 1968, many of which included the classic characteristics of the more universal psychic manifestations. Is it reasonable to draw a parallel between religious apparitions, the fairy faith, the reports of dwarf-like beings with supernatural powers, the airship tales in the United States in the last century, and the present stories of UFO landings? He asks. I would strongly argue that it is, for one simple reason: the mechanisms that have generated these various beliefs are identical. The crux of the problem is to reach beyond the endless reports of varied manifestations and seek out the source, the physical, psychic, of psychological mechanism which has inspired these beliefs. All of these incidents are subjective, that is, we have only the testimony of the witnesses that these peculiar events occurred. Although millions of people have claimed encounters with the ultra-terrestrials in the past 2,000 years, many millions of others have not had such experiences. Astronomers and physicists are neither trained nor equipped to deal with a purely subjective phenomenon. Only a few examples have been given, but it is apparent that Joseph Smith, Cyrus Teed, Helene Smith, and even John Dean were all confronted by the same basic phenomenon. Each approached it in a different, individualized way, and each received information structured to support MS' own beliefs. Albert K. Bender and Teed both explored black magic and alchemy. Both claimed they received complex cosmic theories from para-human entities. Dean asked for and received elaborate facts and figures about extraterrestrial beings and the planets they supposedly inhabited. Like Swedenborg and the biblical prophet Enoch, Helene Smith was shown other worlds and led to believe that she was visiting other planets. Reinhold Schmidt was transported to the center of the pyramid. Bender was taken to underground bases in Antarctica. Others have visited the underground palaces of the fairies and the subterranean cities of the Diros. It is not likely that any of these places exist in reality. It is more likely that these people made hallucinogenic excursions, or mind trips, guided by some force which is capable of manipulating the electrical circuits of the brain. The only alternative explanation is that all these people were liars, hoaxsters, or lunatics. None of the scientists, psychiatrists, and theologians who have investigated these matters have been able to accept such a simple explanation. A remarkable man named Aleister Crowley, born in 1875, became known as the wickedest man in the world through his work in black magic. He too claimed to receive visits from an angel, and he was the center of a large cult around the turn of the century. He was noted for sexually liberating MS female followers, and he published a number of books expounding on his personal cosmology. Those books are currently enjoying a revival of popularity among the youth subculture. In 1939, a young rocket fuel scientist, John Whiteside Parsons, joined the Crowley cult and burrowed into the dark world of magic and the occult. Another practitioner of the mysteries crossed Parsons' path in 1946, and the two became close friends, combining their efforts to conjure up demons and elementals. The newcomer, Lafayette Ronald Hubbard, claimed he had a personal angel, a beautiful red-haired entity whom he called the Empress. The two men donned robes and engaged in secret mystical rites. According to Parsons, they had some success. On the night of January 14, 1946, the electric power failed as they were mumbling incantations, and Hubbard was struck by something on the right shoulder, knocking a candle from his hand. "He called me," Parsons wrote, "and we observed a brownish-yellow light about 7 feet high. I brandished a magical sword, and it disappeared." Ron's right arm was paralyzed for the rest of the night. During one of their rites, Parsons was given this prophecy: "Babylon, the whore of Babylon, is incarnate upon the earth today, awaiting the proper hour of her manifestation. And in that day my work will be accomplished, and I shall be blown away upon the breath of the Father." A rocket fuel explosion at a laboratory in Pasadena in 1952 did blow away the ill-fated Parsons. Lafayette Ronald Hubbard went on to bigger and better things. Born in Tilden, Nebraska in 1911, he served in the Marines, studied engineering, and became a prolific science fiction writer. Sometime around 1948 he began to develop a form of pseudo-psychiatry which he labeled Dianetics. John Campbell, Jr., editor of Astounding Science Fiction, served as one of his first patients and was so impressed by Hubbard's concept that he persuaded him to write an article about it for Ms. Magazine. The article caused such a stir among the science fiction fans that Hubbard quickly churned out a full-length book, Dianetics, The Modern Science of Mental Healing. It became an instant bestseller, and a new movement was born. Teed's neologisms, such as planets are spheres of substance aggregated through the impact of afferent and efferent flux ions of essence, were nothing compared to Hubbard's new vision of the human mind and soul. All our troubles, he decided, were caused by engrams, traumas stored in the unconscious or reactive mind. Patients were guided by auditors, people who have already undergone the process, unearthed their own engrams, and reached the exalted state of clear. The American Medical Association, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and other authorities took a dim view of Dianetics, and Hubbard's career had many ups and downs throughout the 1950s. At one point he publicly claimed that he had even visited Venus. Apparently the friendly Venusians were 100% behind Dianetics. But even with their support, Mr. Hubbard suffered many setbacks and his movement went into limbo for a few years, reappearing in the late 1950s as the Church of Scientology. Inside newsletters and publications distributed to the operators of the Scientology offices or org, short for organization, are written in Hubbard's own unique jargon with emphasis on the magic word cell. In 1962, the Food and Drug Administration raided the founding Church of Scientology in Washington, D.C., and seized literature and a number of emitters. The emitters are a simple electrical device similar to a lie detector and are used by auditors in counseling sessions. On August 30, 1971, Federal District Court Judge Gerhard A. Gesell in Washington ruled in favor of Scientology and ordered the return of the confiscated materials because the FDA failed to prove that the emitters were being sold as healing devices. In the 1960s, Hubbard's movement spread throughout the world despite the opposition of medical societies and legal authorities from Great Britain to Greece. Hubbard now spends most of his time cruising outside the 12-mile limit aboard his magnificently appointed yacht. The Church of Scientology is now a franchise operation with Hubbard receiving a small percentage of the take. He has come a long way since those days when he and Parsons were drawing circles on the floor and praying to unseen demons. The games of the ultra-terrestrials never end. The latest entry is an outfit called Coast Guard Interplanetary, Inc. of Orlando, Florida, who have had difficulties with law enforcement agencies in several states, according to the Better Business Bureau. Coast Guard has been pushing Dare to Be Great, a motivational course consisting of a series of 4 tapes which will tell you how to get rich. The 4 tapes cost only $7,700, but the investment can be quickly recouped by selling the course to others. The whole scheme is based upon a pyramid plan with each student peddling the course to new seekers of truth. Unfortunately, the population of a state cannot support an indefinite selling plan that depends upon recruiting other sellers and students, and the Better Business Bureau has labeled the whole enterprise doubtful and unrealistic. The tapes deal largely with the same philosophy and cosmology found in all the occult lore. Chapter 11. Not one of them who took up in his youth with this opinion that there are no gods ever continued until old age faithful to his conviction. Plato. A New Jersey sign painter named Howard Menger experienced a most revealing flying saucer vision in August 1956, when he came face to face with a godlike being. But according to his book From Outer Space to You, Menger's story began years earlier. As a boy he had encountered a beautiful female entity in a wood and was told that he would one day serve the illustrious space people. As a young man in the army he was again contacted, this time in Juarez, Mexico, by a man with long blonde hair and suntanned skin, riding in a taxicab. Then in the mid-1950s, Menger's real adventures began. Strange aerial objects haunted the area around his home near High Bridge, New Jersey. There were innumerable witnesses, including lawyers, physicists, and reporters. The space people began to drop in on him for coffee and friendly chats about the state of the universe. They asked him to buy dark sunglasses with red lenses, and on several occasions they even pressed him into service as a barber, inviting him to chop off their long blonde tresses so they would look even more human. He was rewarded with a flight to the moon. He brought back some strange rocks which were, he said, moon potatoes. Finally, in August 1956, he met the boss spaceman. A saucer landed in a field near Menger's home, and 2 men stepped out of it. Then a magnificent sight appeared in the doorway, Menger wrote. A Talai, handsome man with long blonde hair over his shoulders stood towering at the entrance. Then he came toward me. But he seemed to float or glide rather than walk. This being was dressed in a radiant white ski-type uniform, the sleeves were full and loose, the neckline was high, similar to that of a turtleneck sweater. He wore a light blue, fluorescent-like cape fastened to his shoulder with a gold pin in the shape of a wheel. His skin was white, and his eyes were the color of goldenrod when it is ripe. His fingers were long and tapering. This super being gave Menger a message of love and truth in the grand tradition of the elementals, then returned to his flying saucer, and so oiled to the stars. When Howard Menger courageously published his story, it was privately printed in 1959. he was roundly cheered by one group of cultists for having solved the UFO mystery and roundly condemned by the equally fanatical scientific ufologists who believed in the existence of extraterrestrial spaceships but could not believe that anyone had ever been close to one. His business collapsed as he gained a reputation for being a crackpot, and his family fell apart. If Howard Menger had lived in another age, he might have been looked upon as great prophet and visionary, one of those privileged individuals who consorted with the gods. Sculptors would have been commissioned to carve mighty replicas of the super being. Poems and songs would have been written about his experience and handed down from one generation to the next. Unfortunately, Menger lived in 1956. He was laughed out of business. His book earned a few $100s from sales to the hardcore cultists and was then forgotten. But it is a revealing record of the mechanism of belief which is at work in these cases. If such things could happen in 1956, then they may also have happened in 1056 and 556 BC. There are in fact extensive legends suggesting that this sort of thing has been happening to men since the beginning of history. The long-haired, long-fingered ultraterrestrials have been walking among us forever. Before we can understand this tangled maze, we must attempt to understand something of the origins and complexities of human history. We must try to ascertain how it all began, how the ultraterrestrials have influenced our course, and where it is all leading us. Our scientists can only guess at how the universe itself came into being. The two most popular theories are the Big Bang concept, already discussed, and the steady-state theory that matter is constantly replenishing itself and that the cosmos really has no beginning or end. The beginning of the solar system and the birth of the planets are a little easier to deal with. The commonly accepted theory is that the planets are cooling masses of material ejaculated from the sun. Two independent scientists, Dr. C. J. Hyman and C. William Kinsman, have developed a new geocosmic theory based upon the new discoveries outlined in earlier chapters, coupled with Velikovsky-like evidence and speculations. They suggest that Earth once pursued the orbit now occupied by Venus and that Mars was in the present Earth orbit. This would explain the legends of early man, which claimed that Earth days and years were once shorter than they are now and that the human lifespan was once considerably longer. Ancient calendars carved in stone also indicate important differences in the early Earth years. If the Earth began as a lump of matter cast off by the Sun, it may have first passed along the orbit of Mercury before spiraling outward and settling into the orbit of Venus. This could have happened 5 billion years ago. The cooling planet Earth could have reached the life support stage hundreds of millions of years ago. And it could have been inhabited while it was in the Venus orbit. If Mars was then in the Earth orbit, it too could have supported life. But as it was pushed further into space by the approach of Earth, the Martians either died out or were forced to make radical biological adjustments to their new environment. In a recent letter, Kinsman also proposes that there was some efforts to crossbreed Martians with Earthlings. He states, "If Mars was pushed out there in our Permian times to make way for Earth in our present orbits, its environmental change and climate in this some 300 million years would surely modify its humanoids, because of the scarcity of air, water, and warmth, into presumably a more scrawny physique no longer adapted to normal life on Earth. Presumably for millions of years they have been trying to hybridize their fauna and flora with ours and to develop some sort of humanoid to whom they could bequeath the advances which their dying civilization had long since acquired. Success in this seems to have finally come with the sudden hybrid appearance of Cro-Magnon man some 50,000 years ago. They may have visited us frequently and openly for such time as they could stand it, until a few millennia ago, when men were still few and fearful. If the Earth did begin in another orbit and did undergo the changes postulated by these scientists, it may have been even more unstable than it is now and cataclysmic occurrences would have been logical." Velikovsky pointed out that human folklore has recorded many such cataclysms, including a period when the entire Earth was bathed in total darkness for 3 or more days. The Earth may have followed an elliptical orbit which carried it so far away from the Sun that it was plunged into darkness. Then it looped back and fell into the present orbit. Elementals have constantly TTID occultists and UFO contacts that mankind began on Ventis and that orbital changes have taken place in the past and will recur in the future. On April 24, 1964, a farmer named Gary Wilcox allegedly had a 2-hour conversation with a pair of faceless little men from a flying saucer in a field near Newark Valley, New York. Among other things, he said, they told him that the Earth would soon be where Mars is now. Many flying saucer books have followed the premise that the Earth was originally seeded by beings from outer space. Man has always assumed that the frequently observed parahumas had to originate from beyond our planet or even from beyond our solar system or space-time continuum. Science writer Otto Binder's flying saucers are watching vs. dealt at length with the theories of an engineer named Max H. Flint. Flint proposed that man is a hybrid from the union of ancient spacemen and some earthly species of man-ape who existed, according to recent anthropological finds, as long as 2 million years ago. More orthodox scientists have struggled for the past 100 years to find a provable system of evolution to account for man's appearance. The commonly accepted view is that man was a mere animal for thousands of years, and he somehow suddenly developed intelligence and consciousness and quickly evolved from a low hairy animal to his present exalted status of low hairless animal. The mythical missing link of the Sunday supplements is supposed to be the animal that bridged the two orders of life. Is the movie 2001, Arthur C. Clarke solved the problem by having a sudden outside influence, the slab-like monolith, appear in the midst of a group of apes. It led them to discover tools, namely clubs, and they began bashing in each other's heads. There are really only 3 primary theories for the origin of man. The religious theory, man was created by some greater intelligence through the manipulation of physical matter and energy. The cultist theory, man migrated to Earth from some other planet, or he was seeded here by some other race, or he was produced when some other race crossbred with earthly animals and produced the present strain of Homo sapiens. The theory of evolution, a series of random chemical and bio-1C Dr. Berthold Schwartz's psychiatric study of Mr. Wilk in UFO percipients. Logical accidents took place over a period of millions of years, and man slowly evolved from lower life forms. Billions of people have believed and still believe in supernatural creation. A few million accept Darwin's theory of evolution, and only a few thousand are even willing to consider the seeded idea. The real truth may be a combination of all 3. Of the 3, evolution is actually the weakest and the most difficult to support. Evolution adequately explains the development of living species, the process of natural selection, and the other things, but it fails to provide a rational and provable explanation for the process of creation itself. Scientists shrug this off with limp statements about how bolts of lightning struck puddles of chemicals and induced life. But if such a lightning process were true, it should be still continuing, and it should be easy to duplicate in our laboratories. The fact that it is not a discernible continuing process, new species are not constantly appearing, and that we have not managed to duplicate it weakens the concept. The Japanese have myths and legends which claim that their islands were first settled by beings who descended from the sky. These stories are a part of the Japanese culture. The Eskimos believe they were somehow flown to the Arctic Circle in ancient times. The natives of the Sahara Desert have folklore about blue-skinned people from the sky who had such impact that certain tribes still dye their skins blue in emulation of these ancient cosmic beings. Deep in the Biankara Yula Mountains of China there is a tribe of diminutive people about 4 feet high. Hieroglyphs have been found in that region, on the border of China and Tibet, by Russian archaeologists. When translated, these records describe how members of the Dropa tribe came to Earth in some kind of flying machine. The stone discs bearing these inscriptions have been dated at about 12,000 years. Ancient graves have also been found there containing small human bodies with huge craniums and underdeveloped skeletons. There is, in fact, a staggering amount of historical and archaeological evidence to support the seeded notion, while the evolutionists are obliged to fall back on a few fragments of fossils and a mountain of conjecture. The concept of supernatural creation is wholly dependent upon the religious texts and the testimony of the ultra-terrestrials. The story of Adam and Eve can be found in the ancient writings of the Greeks, Syrians, Egyptians, Abyssinians, Hebrews, and many other ancient peoples. Like the tales of the Deluge and the Ark, the Garden of Eden is a universal myth. Unlike the Deluge stories, it seems to be largely allegorical. Archaeologists digging in the Middle East have found artifacts which indicate that Neanderthal, Cro-Magnon, and modern men all existed during the same period. This not only shoots down the theory of evolution, but it suggests that modern man, a creature with a conscience and a consciousness, was separate and distinct from primitive man. If we ever manage to assemble a more accurate history of Earth, we may find that modern man is the descendant of the survivors of some earlier civilization which existed thousands, even millions, of years ago, and that he has no direct biological linkage with the lower animals at all. We must not ignore the possibility that the Earth was originally colonized by beings from some other point in space. Historians and archaeologists are troubled by the fact that mankind seems to have appeared quite suddenly on this planet. Either we were placed here, even stranded here, at some point between 30 and 70,000 years ago. Or we were created in some fashion millions of years after the Earth itself had been created and had passed through many ages during which it supported different kinds of non-human life. The process of creation is explained somewhat in the religious and occult texts. We are told that the first man, Adam, was an androgynous being directly linked with the supermind of the universe. He was a temporary transmogrification of energy, an ultra-terrestrial who became locked into a physical form. Once this descent occurred, he was given a mate so that he could reproduce. The Earth was already inhabited by two distinct life forms. There were primitive animals, which might have included cavemen as well as lower beasts. Perhaps the cavemen were an earlier experiment which was failing. There were also thousands, if not millions, of non-physical beings from the world of higher frequencies, who occupied the Earth by sharing the same space with the planet. These beings may have been free from the greater intelligence, fallen angels, or they may have been under the control of a lesser intelligence. In any cases, the Earth was their personal playground. They owned it. Now suddenly, a group, or several groups, of ultra-terrestrials from a higher plane descended to Earth. They were forbidden to do certain things. We can't even guess what those things were. In the scriptures, Adam and Eve were forbidden to eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This was probably more symbolism, and the true meaning is lose. A British scholar, Brinsley Le Poer Trench, has studied the ancient scriptures carefully and produced two important books, The Sky People and Men Among Mankind, to explain his theories. He describes and defines the people of the serpent. These people may have been the fallen angels or devils who later plagued Adam and Eve. If they felt they were owners of the Earth, they may have greatly resented this huge flock of ultra-terrestrials, and they may have conspired to lead the Adam and Eve group to destruction by getting them to violate the orders of their overlord. A battle now takes shape. A lesser group of ultra-terrestrials, UTs, is in possession of the Earth. A bunch of newcomers invades the planet, and perhaps their ruling intelligence has a plan, a very long-range plan, to wrest the Earth from the owners. Masses of energy cannot fight with bombs, bullets, and arrows. They need a physical battlefield and physical armies. The whole thing must be played out like some gigantic chess game. The first step is to create the necessary physical army. Tactics must be invented so that the physical army can overthrow the non-physical owners. The game becomes incredibly complex. If several different super-intelligences were involved, then one group of ultra-terrestrials would descend or be materialized in Japan and China, bearing the specific racial characteristics imposed upon them by their overlord. Another overlord would plant his soldiers in Africa, another would create Indians in North and South America, and so on. In the beginning, one super-intelligence may have tried to utilize the Neanderthal men as his physical army. Ultra-terrestrials were sent down the frequency scale to help guide the cavemen. To facilitate communication between the UTs and the Neanderthal men, the tall, blonde, normally sexless UTs were made to more closely resemble their primitive contacts. They were given sexes but were forbidden to participate in the pleasurable rites of sex, the tree of the knowledge. The serpent people were sometimes able to control groups of cavemen and managed to trick some of the tits into breaking their chastity. The UTs engaged in sexual intercourse with the cave women. This crossbreeding between Adam, ultra-terrestrial, types and lower animals is suggested in Genesis 25:1934, and relates a miraculous birth, nervous system. Emotions were born. Frequencies were changed. The direct control of the superintelligence was driven from their bodies. They were trapped on Earth, unable to ascend the electromagnetic scale and re-enter their etheric world. With the loss of control they became animals, albeit highly intelligent animals. Since the UT's memories were part of the greater intelligence, the loss of contact meant also the complete loss of their former identity. They were locked on this planet, leaderless, in a totally strange and hostile environment. The first UTs to be thus trapped became the first real men. They had to learn to hunt and kill, to build fires in huts. They were lost, the victims of the first battle between the Serpent People and the Ultimate Intelligence. Now the Serpent People, or Omega Group, attacked man in various ways, trying to rid the planet of him. But the Super's intelligence was still able to look over man, and new, more tightly controlled UTs were sent to offer advice and assistance. Earliest man was told in carefully simplified ways of his origin and purpose. The superintelligence became God, and early man worshipped him, in many ways and under many names. God worked out new ways of communication and control, always in conflict with the Serpent People. Much is made of the fact that Adam and Eve were terrified the first night, indicating that they were unused to a world without light. Perhaps as ultraterrestrials they were accustomed to total vision or perception of all the frequencies. Life on those higher planes would be bathed in continuous radiation, and there would be no night or day. No time. Now Adam and Eve were not only trapped on this miserable little planet, but they were also caught up in a world that moved in a single direction through the field of time. This would take some getting used to, even if they couldn't remember their previous existence as UTs. Through intercourse with the existing cave people, the fallen UTs produced the new races of man. They were the missing link. And in Isaac's barren wife Rebekah suddenly conceived, and the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in thy womb, and 2 manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels, and the one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger. Rebekah gave birth to twins, and one, Esau, came out red all over like an garment. Later Esau sold his birthright to Jacob. Many ways all 3 of our hypotheses for the origin of man became correct. Evolution is involved. Extraterrestrial descent is involved. Creation is involved. In some parts of the world the Serpent People successfully posed as gods and imitated the techniques of the superintelligence. This led to the formation of pagan religions centered around human sacrifices. The conflicts, so far as man himself was concerned, became one of religions and races. Whole civilizations based upon the worship of these false gods rose and fell in Asia, Africa, and South America. The battleground had been chosen, and the mode of conflict had been decided upon. The human race would supply the pawns. The mode of control was complicated as usual. Human beings were largely free of direct control. Each individual had to consciously commit himself to one of the opposing forces. After that commitment was made voluntarily, the chosen force could possess the individual to some degree. The UTs very carefully explained this process to the early priests, who interpreted it and tried to pass it on to their followers. The rites of baptism were born. The main battle was for what was to become known as the human soul. Once an individual had committed himself, he opened a door so that an indefinable something, probably an undetectable mass of intelligent energy, could actually enter his body and exercise some control over his subconscious mind. This soul was directly linked with the superintelligence and with all similar souls, thus making possible mental telepathy, prophetic dreams, and other wonders. In those thousands of cases in which this subconscious force lapsed over into the conscious mind, we find destructive fanaticism and obsession. If the controlling intelligence was Omega, anti-human, the stricken individual suffers from insanity or commits criminal actions, social disorders, and so on. If this soul abandons the living body, total disorientation could conceivably result. The body might enter a mindless catatonic trance. Persons with an advanced soul could consciously eject it from their bodies for short periods and indulge in astral projection. The body would appear to be dead, or almost dead, during this period of desertion. In astral projection literature we are told about a silver cord which seems to connect the free-flying soul with the sleeping body. If that cord is cut or broken, the soul can't re-enter the body, and it dies or is possessed by an evil force. Astral projectionists claim that sometimes when they return to their body, they find a dark elemental engulfing it, trying to possess it during their absence, and they have to fight the evil thing off. The validity of astral projection is debatable, of course. But let's suppose for a moment that it is a genuine phenomenon. If some people can project themselves consciously and remember the experience, then it is also possible that many others project their souls while asleep. They're never aware that they're doing it. The liberated souls fly about, perhaps rendezvousing with other souls to receive orders or some programming process. If the soul is some kind of ultra-high frequency energy, then it could be visible to some sensitive people as a blob of faint light in the night sky. In other words, some UFOs could be astral travelers. Flying saucer contacts usually end up talking about souls and reincarnation. Karma. The UFO entities try to convey the truth about reincarnation to the people they approach. Not many of these people are able to properly interpret what they have been told. Several major religions, particularly in the Orient, are based upon the principles of reincarnation. In Tibet, when a Dalai Lama dies, the priests go out and scour the mountains searching for a small child who possesses specific birthmarks and other things which identify him as the reincarnated High Lama. Sometimes the search goes on for years. When a likely prospect is finally found, several religious and personal articles are spread before him. If the child goes unerringly for those items which had been owned by the dead Dalai Lama, he is declared the new ruler. This system works and has been in use for centuries. There are hundreds of carefully investigated and authenticated cases of reincarnation. As might be expected, a majority of these occur in India and other countries where belief in karma runs high. Usually, small children are involved. Such children recall completely their previous life in a distant village, and when investigators take them to that village, they recognize everything and everyone, have a tearful reunion with their former family, and are even able to describe in detail how they died. Actually, true reincarnation is impossible. Memory is stored by an electrical system in the brain, and when the brain dies, all memories are also cancelled out. Our personalities, egos, emotional structure, and memories are all part of the brain's complex circuitry. The brain dies very quickly, as soon as the oxygen supply is cut off. All of this circuitry dies with it, like a radio being turned off. If the soul is merely a mass of high-frequency energy, then it would not retain either memory or personality. When the body, or host, dies, this mass of energy would be liberated either to rejoin the main intelligence of which it is always a part or to find and possess a new host. It would not carry along any memory of its previous body or life. However, the computer-like superintelligence would have a complete memory of that other life stored within it. It could feed that information to another brain by channeling it through any soul at random. A person recalling a past life under hypnosis, there are thousands of cases of this, might actually just be tuning his subconscious into the central computer. There may be some subtle need on the intelligence's part to bring about interest and investigation into a specific past life. So the hypnotized person is fed the information. In OSP we are told that all cases of reincarnation are the work of mischievous spirits known as engrafters. An engrafter swoops down on an uncommitted soul and possesses it, feeding a complete memory of a past life into the brain. The main information passed along to contacts is simply that the human body provides a host for a fragment of this undefinable soul energy. The major religions have been telling us this for thousands of years, pointing out that the human race supplies the shells for souls. Man's ego has demanded that he embellish this truth by adding the belief that his pitiful personality is worthy of preservation and that his memories and personality go along with the soul. The Omega Group has made a game of this belief at millions of seances, happily posing as myriad souls of the dear departed. Two or more intelligences are playing a game with us, vying for complete control of our bodies and souls, according to all occult and religious interpretations. It's a seesaw battle, and every possible kind of deception and deceit is being employed by both sides. They CAA make us believe anything they want us to believe, thanks to our swollen egos and flimsy brains. They can make us see anything they want us to see, thanks to our narrow field of vision. We can only see a dot fragment of the electromagnetic spectrum, and their apparent ability to manipulate energy and physical matter. The para-human serpent people of the past are still among us. They were probably worshipped by the builders of Stonehenge and the forgotten ridge-making cultures of South America. They directed us to multiply and seed the earth. Their manifestations and manipulations have generated thousands of cults, religions, and frames of reference. In recent years, hundreds of UFO contacts have been warned by the long-haired Venusians that our atomic experiments will lead to disaster. Could it be, as some have said, that atomic bombs not only kill cities, but that they also kill or disintegrate souls? If the soul is a fragment of energy linked to some great mass of energy, then this anti-atomic bomb posture of the ultra-terrestrials could be defensive. The bomb at Hiroshima may have blown a hole in some other world beyond our space-time continuum, and a lot of moon food may have been lost in Thai bargain. Chapter 12. The Demise of the Gods. If flying saucers are real, the skeptics say, why don't they contact us? The startling truth, as carefully recorded by the ancient historians, is that the ultra-terrestrials have always been in direct contact with millions of individuals and that they actually ruled directly over mankind for many years. In recent centuries their influence has become more subtle, but it is always there. According to the traditions of many isolated peoples, the first great emperors in Asia were god-kings who came down from the sky, displayed amazing superhuman abilities, and took over. There was a veritable worldwide epidemic of these god-kings between 5000 and 1000 BC. The mighty Osiris and Isis walked into the Egyptian valley out of nowhere and assumed command. The myths and legends of Greece, India, and South America describe their rule. They were taller and more imposing than the men of the time, with long blonde hair, marble-like white skin, and remarkable powers which enabled them to perform miracles. They displayed brilliant judgment and wisdom and exercised remarkable organizational abilities. In most cases they chose to reside on the highest mountains and hills available, commanding balls of fire and bolts of lightning and traveling about the skies in wonderful chariots. In southern Europe Zeus and his court of phantom cohorts held forth for centuries. In India a multitude of gods and demons appeared and reappeared generation after generation. Others arrived on the scene and made lasting contributions to folklore from Iceland to Scandinavia. In Central America the legendary Quetzalcoatl appeared among the Toltecs. Me was a white man dressed in a long white robe covered with tiny red crosses. He wore a great beard and according to Toltec tradition introduced science and learning to the natives. After many years of benign rule he simply vanished, promising to return again one day. When Cortés, the Spanish conquistador, landed in Mexico 1,000 years later, the Indians greeted him with delight, believing that he was Quetzalcoatl. He took advantage of their superstition and sacked the Aztec Empire. Deep in the wasteland of Western Australia the Aborigines still cling to the ancient myths of the Wanajina and regard as sacred the petroglyphs carved into rocks depicting tall, robed figures. The Vivongina are supposedly a para-human group who resided in Australia thousands of years ago. Beresis, an ancient Babylonian priest, recorded the fascinating legend of Khan, a remarkable creature who came up out of the waters of the Persian Gulf to educate early man. This legend more nearly fulfills some of our criteria for a genuine contact myth, Dr. Carl Sagan states in his Intelligent Life in the Universe. Beresis presumably had access to cuneiform and pictographic records dating back several thousand years before his time. His work was translated into Greek and Latin and found its way into English in 1876. He quoted from Apollodorus, describing Oannes as a fish-like animal capable of speaking to men. The account explains. This being in the daytime used to converse with men but took no food at that season, and he gave them an insight into letters and sciences and every kind of art. He taught them to construct houses, to found temples, to compile laws, and explain to them the principles of geometrical knowledge. He made them distinguish the seeds of the earth and showed them how to collect fruits. When the sun set, it was the custom of this being to plunge again into the sea and abide all night in the deep, for he was amphibious. Moses, of course, had another kind of encounter when he climbed to the summit of Mount Sinai and received orders and taws from the entity who settled there in a glowing cloud. A central legend of the Hopi Indians concerns the Kachina clan, a group of beings who were not people but spirits sent to give help and guidance, taking the forms of ordinary people, according to Indian historian Frank Waters. The Hopi believe they came originally from a red city in the south and that their tribe was guided into what is now the southwestern United States by the Kachina clan. These spirit beings taught the Hopis occult wisdom very similar to the occult beliefs of the Europeans and Africans. Finally they departed, saying, "The time for us to go to our far-off planets and stars has not come yet. But it is time for us to leave you. We will go by our powers to a certain high mountain, which you will know, where we will await your messages of need. We are a spirit people, and we will not be seen again by you or your people. But you must remember us by wearing our masks and our costumes at the proper ceremonial times. Those who do so must be only those persons who have acquired the knowledge and the wisdom we have taught you." The indigenous natives of the Americas, Africa, and the Pacific all adopted ceremonial dress patterned after the garb of the ultra-terrestrials, just as the robes and trappings of the early churches opound the white man were patterned after the dress of the angels and gods who allegedly visited them. Traditionally, only the witch doctors and students of the arcane wisdom of the elementals were permitted to wear these garments and masks. The carefully laid out procedures for the ceremonies and rites of these early peoples were all dictated by these para-human spirits. For thousands of years they quite literally had the entire human race dancing to their tunes. The impact of these beings upon the human race is indisputable. All human art began as part of our urge to pay tribute to them. The arts of painting and sculpture, the arts of drama and dance, and of course, the art of storytelling, were all products of that urge. It has been impossible to adequately summarize even a fragment of this land of material here. Perhaps someday some scholar will systematically assemble all of these records and establish some order out of the chaos. The evidence is not as flimsy as this kind of summary might make it seem. Statues of strange, Oriental-looking figures bearing a striking similarity to the appearance of our contemporary men in black have been found in the ruins of the Olmec civilization in Mexico. We really don't know very much about the Olmecs. The first traces of their highest culture were uncovered in 1939, when archaeologist Matthew Sterling found 5 gigantic basalt heads on the island of La Venta. These heads weigh from 20 to 30 tons each and are up to 9 feet high. Each is wearing what looks like a football helmet. Since then, cities and irrigation systems dating back to at least 1200 BC have been discovered. An Olmec calendar carved into the stomach of an 8-inch jade statue begins with the year 3113 BC. It is a masterpiece of mathematical and astronomical knowledge, and it was the Olmecs, not the Maya, who developed it, Gene Reinhardt noted in Science Digest in September 1967. Archaeologists have come up with an interesting theory for the sexless Oriental Eek statues. They suggest that the Olmecs worshipped deformed children and that the statues represent Mongolian idiots. But would a people capable of creating a masterpiece of a calendar worship abnormal babies? The statues also feature a distinctive cleft in their foreheads, and this falls in line with the third eye lore of European occultism, Tibetan beliefs, and even the mysticism of the Hop Indians. The third eye is supposedly the part of the brain which is linked to ESP and cosmic consciousness or direct communication with God. The third eye symbol, an eye inside a triangle, is an ancient symbol for the deity found in many cultures from Egypt to Micronesia. It appears on the Great Seal of the United States atop the pyramid, found on every dollar bill. The Kachina clan taught the Hopis that an opening in the head existed so they could talk with God. At one time trephination, cutting a hole in the skull, was a common practice throughout the world, perhaps as part of some religious rite. Hundreds of trephinated skulls have been found in Europe, Asia, Africa, the Americas, and the Pacific Islands. Many of them date back to 3000 BC. Some show signs of healing, indicating that the patient must have survived what is even today an extremely delicate operation. 370 such skulls have been found in Europe, but the finest examples come from Peru. The very thought of thousands, or even millions of early humans voluntarily submitting to having holes bored in their skulls with primitive flint instruments is enough to make anyone's flesh crawl. Some anthropologists speculate that trephination was used as a treatment to get rid of possessing spirits. But the universality of this very sophisticated operation makes this unlikely. Were all those people seeking to open the door in their heads so they could communicate with the supernatural? If so, who or what taught the entire human race this process? And why? In legend after legend from every part of the world we are told that early man was primitive and stagnant until the appearance of the god kings. These mysterious beings introduced writing, laws, agriculture, and perhaps even the rudiments of stone building and medicine. The early peoples were so impressed and so grateful that they dedicated much of their time and effort to preserving images of the god kings in great statues, temples, and monuments. In fact, many cultures left nothing behind except religious artifacts and carvings lovingly detailing their encounters with the gods. Identical beliefs appeared simultaneously in all parts of the world. Identical forms of writing suddenly came into practice among cultures completely isolated from each other. The Egyptians were not the only ones who believed that the human body would one day be resurrected whole and that therefore all earthly possessions should be buried with it. Ancient tombs in China, Siberia, and South America were also filled with relics for a future life. How did this relatively complex concept spread to the four corners of the earth? Even the earliest of men were not so stupid that they could sustain a belief century after century without some kind of evidence to support it. Nor would they be so stupid as to expend their energies, materials, and talents building great monuments to those beliefs without such evidence. Yet the reasonably sophisticated peoples of India and Greece believed wholeheartedly in their gods for thousands of years. Their records demonstrated that these gods appeared frequently before mortal men, taught them, tricked them, offered them hope and faith, and cultivated their religions and beliefs. Temples were erected on the spots where the gods had stood from Stonehenge to Delphi. Often the percipients were instructed to build a temple on this spot. Gold, atomic number, 79, has always played an important role in all religions, and most religious buildings are roofed with gold leaf from Buddhist temples to Muslim mosques and Christian cathedrals. Could it be that the mysterious rays of the ancients are somehow able to adjust more easily to the frequency of gold? On holy days a great part of the world's population gathers under these golden roofs to pray and meditate and perhaps to have their minds probed by some invisible concentration of energy. The modern cults and sciences have seized upon the god-king legends to support their own beliefs and conclusions. Atlantologists prefer to think that Quetzalcoatl and his kin were really from Atlantis. The ufologists have churned out scores of books based on the premise that spacemen visited Earth and gave mankind a helping hand in those distant days. It is quite true that the Kashtia clan and most of the other para-humans claimed some relationship to other worlds and far-off stars, particularly the Pleiades. In all these legends there is another persistent theme, that the god kings mated with mortal women, impregnated them and thus started a royal lineage. Tradition claims that the blue bloods of royalty actually had blue blood in their veins in early history, perhaps as a result of this crossbreeding. Even today some royal families suffer from hemophilia. The blood lacks the ability to coagulate and even a small cut becomes a serious wound. The mating of ordinary women with supernatural beings is an integral part of all religious lore. It is emphasized in the Bible. Some modern rulers such as the Emperor of Japan still claim their family can be traced all the way back to a godlike ancestor. The pharaoh system in Egypt could have begun in this fashion with the para-human leader of the early Egyptians turning his rule over to a human offspring. By 1000 BC most of the god kings had withdrawn, presumably going off to their legendary mountain hideaways. Their followers assumed, however, that their human descendants were equally wise and possessed of magical powers. Being human, these fallible kings often exploited the fears and beliefs of their people. The later pharaohs successfully masqueraded as gods for centuries. The earth had been divided up by the god kings, each ruling, even owning, a specific area. This ownership was passed on to the human heirs, and for thousands of years a few dozen families literally owned the entire planet. They intermarried and managed to keep the system going until modern times. Although the king system degenerated slowly, it did not really collapse until 1848. The god kings did not put all their eggs in one basket. They established parallel systems of communication and control by establishing priesthoods and strange secret cults and societies whose main purpose was to perpetuate their esoteric teachings. But again, the flaws in man's basic character eventually surfaced. Greed and the lust for power caused some of these groups to exploit the populaces. There were periods in history when some of these priesthoods and societies even gained political control in Egypt and elsewhere. It is probable that this happened in the burgeoning South American cultures and may even have led to the downfall of some of them. A key claim of the early priesthoods was their purported ability to consult with the ultraterrestrials through the use of special plates, amulets, and crystals handed down to them. These artifacts were usually worn about the head and heart during religious ceremonies. In the apocryphal Proto-Evangelion we are told that Joachim, father of the Virgin Mary, visited a priest and said, "If the Lord be propitious to me, let the plate which is on the priest's forehead make it manifest." And he consulted the plate the priest wore and saw it, and behold, sin was not found in him. Such a plate is described in Exodus 28:36. Early kings and dictators purportedly consulted with angels and supernatural beings who appeared frequently to advise them. Historical records assert that everyone from Julius Caesar to Napoleon had meetings with mysterious para-humans who materialized and dematerialized mysteriously. The sacred crown of Saint Stephen is supposed to have been delivered by an angel to a pope who permitted Stephen I to be crowned king of Hungary with it in 1001. The mysterious gypsies sometimes claim their amulets and crystal bales were given to them by ultraterrestrials. Numerous modern flying saucer contacts display tektites and pieces of quartz which they say were given to them by Venusians. Mr. Ralph Lale, a businessman in North Carolina who once ran for Congress, visited a cavern deep in Brown Mountain under the auspices of the Space People, he says, and was later flown to Venus. He was given some chunks of crystal as proof of his claims. When Joseph Smith dictated the Book of Mormon to his wife, he sat behind a screen with the gold plates, apparently translating them with the crystalline devices he had found in the stone box. Modern UFO contactee writings are filled with enigmatic statements about crystals and how they hold some key to the mysteries of the universe. There are many interpretations of such statements, but no one has managed to crack their true meaning. In the past 20 years, however, crystals have suddenly assumed great importance to our technology. We call them transistors. Although Fawells and Bergier shrug off the UFO mystery in their The Dawn of Magic, they seem to subscribe to the cultist belief that spacemen representing a superior technology once visited the Earth. They offer their charming cargo cult theory, speculating that early man's religious rites were actually based upon their observations of the strange behavior of the god kings. A god king manipulated a radio and talked into a stick, microphone. Presto, a fleet of aerial vehicles soon arrived with supplies. After the departure of the god kings, men tried to imitate them by chanting into sticks too, and so prayer was born. This brings us full circle. The ultraterrestrials imitated the appearance of man, and eventually man began to imitate them in his rites and ceremonies. We made masks and costumes duplicating their strange appearance. We hauled enormous rocks hundreds of miles and carved replicas of their features for our temples and cities. Whole civilizations of stone builders apparently committed themselves entirely to the service of the god kings and willingly sacrificed thousands of their own people in bloody ceremonies on the sacred hilltops in tribute to these beings. For many centuries human sacrifices played an important role in the religion of all the people of the earth. In the Bible, animal sacrifices are described. Even Abraham led his son to a mountain and prepared to kill him in sacrifice to the Elohim, the original biblical word, which is plural and means gods. It has been given singular translation in the Modem Bible. The early priesthoods wielded considerable power. Oracles and mediums resided in the great temples, issuing accurate prophecies, and many inaccurate ones. It was a time of miracles and magic. The priests were the only educated men, and as usual some were unscrupulous enough to turn a neat profit from the beliefs of the people. But gradually the old tried and true methods for communicating with the ultra-terrestrials began to fail. According to legend, there was great rivalry among the gods. False messengers betrayed the believers and caused all kinds of mischief. And around 500 BC a new force began to make its presence felt among men. In India, a wealthy young man named Siddhartha Gautama fell asleep under a tree, so the story goes, and when he awoke, he was filled with a great new philosophy, a new view of man's relationship to the cosmos. He renounced all his worldly goods and set forth to preach under the name of Buddha. Around that same time a Persian named Zoroaster underwent a similar experience and founded a great religion. While in far-off China the great philosopher Lao Tse created Taoism and reshaped the thinking of the Orient along with another contemporary, Confucius. In the Middle East several of the biblical prophets, including Zechariah and Daniel, were conversing with supernatural entities and undergoing illuminating experiences. None of these men knew that the others even existed. Many centuries would pass before their independent ideas and teachings would spread and overlap. Yet in time these men, all contemporaries between 600 and 500 BC, changed the philosophical and theological structure of the civilized world. Because of them that century stands as a landmark in the history of our planet. So the old priesthoods deteriorated, some were slaughtered outright, and new beliefs were born. These beliefs centered around the awareness that there was some force beyond the ultra-terrestrials, that mankind was only part of a larger pattern, and that individuals were merely an extension of some distant, unknown intelligence. The stage was being set for a new conflict, a battle royal between the old gods and this cosmic consciousness. Muhammad appeared 1,000 years later to lead the Arab people away from the old gods, rallying his people with the chant, "There is but one God, and that God is Allah." Instead of simply disappearing under the wave of monotheism, the old priesthoods went underground, becoming secret societies devoted to preserving the teachings of the elementals and the secrets of communication. There was already a tangled maze of such societies, such as the Druids mentioned earlier, so the ultra-terrestrials had plenty of followers even into the newly enlightened age. The Romans were still worshipping their gods on Mount Olympus, and the Hebrews were firm in their belief of Jehovah. Then one day 3 expensively robed gentlemen with oriental features strode into the court of King Herod and informed him that a most remarkable child was about to be born somewhere in Judea. Meanwhile the angel Gabriel visited Mary and told her she was to bear this child. The 3 Orientals made their way to Bethlehem, accompanied by a brilliant glowing object in the sky. Joseph left Mary in a cave, according to the Proto-Evangelion, while he went to seek a midwife to help with the birth. Then time stood still. Chapter 8 of the Proto-Evangelion relates. "But as I was going," said Joseph, "I looked up into the air, and I saw the clouds astonished, and the fowls of the air stopping in the midst of the flight. And I looked towards the earth and saw a table spread and working people sitting around it, but their hands were upon the table, and they did not move to eat. They who had meat in their mouths did not eat. And they who lifted them up to their mouths did not put anything in, but all their faces were fixed upwards. And I beheld sheep dispersed, and yet the sheep stood still. And the shepherd lifted up his hand to smite them, and his hand continued up. And I looked unto a river and saw the kids with their mouths close to the water and touching it, but they did not drink." Unbelievable though it may be, this paralysis of time is common in UFO and psychic lore. It is almost as if the world is frozen like a frame of a movie film projected on a screen. Time continues to flow only for the percipient. When Joseph returned to the cave with a midwife, they found it filled with blinding light. The Christ child was born. The birth, and death of Christ had been prophesied centuries earlier. Brethren of the Qumran priesthood even established a regular night watch, scanning the skies of Judea in expectation of some sign of the heavens. Although the exact birth date of Christ remains a controversy, most theologians and scholars believe that it was sometime in the year 4 BC. That year, according to the astrological records of the Qumran priests, a comet produced a heavenly spectacle, and there was a fiery conjunction of several planets in the zodiacal sign of Pisces. Pragmatists naturally assume that the Star of Bethlehem was that comet, and to followers of Velikovsky, it might have been the comet Venus. Jesus' appointed role seems to have been to try to lure the Hebrews away from Jehovah to worship the supermind of the cosmos, the god of the Oriental illumined ones. In this he failed. The Jew dollar had had considerable experience with miracles and false angels, and they viewed Christ with great suspicion. The Romans who occupied Judea were still worshipping their assortment of long-haired deities, so they also frowned upon the activities of this strangely persuasive man. However, the sequence of events surrounding the death of Christ provided proof enough to sway many into Christian beliefs and lay the foundation for the great Christian religions. An eclipse of the sun threw the land into darkness as Christ hung suspended on the cross. A violent earthquake which claimed many lives followed. Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea, later collected the witnesses of these events and had them dictate to scribes what they had seen. This record was sent on to Rome. Pilate eventually committed suicide. The body of Christ was placed in a cave, according to the historical records, and a huge stone was rolled in place to seal the entrance. Roman guards were stationed there to keep watch, they testified later. There was a great voice in the heavens, and they saw the heavens open, and two men descend from thence with great light and approach the tomb. And that stone which was put at the door rolled of itself and made way in part, and the tomb was opened, and both young men entered in. When therefore those soldiers saw it, they awakened the centurion and the elders, for they too were hard by keeping guard. And as they had seen, again they see three men come forth from the tomb, and two of them were supporting one and a cross following them. In other texts these two young men were described as wearing brilliantly white costumes, and the soldiers were reportedly paralyzed like dead men, unable to move a muscle while the body of Christ was being removed. Later the heavens again were seen to open to and a certain man to descend and enter the sepulchre. This certain man remained behind, for when the soldiers and followers of Christ approached the tomb, this being told them not to be frightened and advised them that Christ had been taken or had risen. 1 Here we have an extraordinary sequence of events and coincidences. Natural catastrophes struck the exact area where Christ died. A group of witnesses heard a sound in the sky, saw a brilliant light, and were rendered immobile as two beings descended, entered the tomb, and removed the body. One entity remained behind to make sure that everyone knew what had happened. Later the ghost of Christ appeared before his disciples to further explain the concept of resurrection. A concept which, as has already been pointed out, can be traced back to the early Egyptian civilization. Christ's ministry was brief, spanning only a few years. He traveled only a few hundred miles and spoke to only a few thousand people. Nevertheless, his impact upon human history is undeniable and immeasurable. Buddha and Lao Tzu changed the whole texture of life in the Orient, and then 500 years later Christ wrought a similar change in the West. A series of minor miracles, visitations, and supernatural manifestations reinforced the beliefs of the early Christians, and they willingly died in Roman circuses for those beliefs. Then gradually the pure Christian concepts were absorbed into the established God-King system. Opportunists and exploiters moved in as the Roman Empire collapsed, about AD 476, and the Dark Ages began. The biblical records were suppressed, censored, and distorted. A succession of religious wars swept the West, claiming the lives of millions.